Good day, everyone. Welcome to Deku Universe. Today we are beginning part 1 of What If Deku Joined DXD and Accidentally Started a Hero Harem. The fanfiction is created by NINJ45Word on archiveofourown.org. Now let's begin. Mizutefu, Japan, Alderet Junior High School, 2265. One was a soul drowning in 10 years of silence and scorch marks. The other was a loud-mouthed empath with a heart too big for his own good. It wasn't the number one hero who saved Midoriya Izuku that day. It was a pervert with a plan. If you want a quirk so much, there might be a way for you to do it. An ash-blonde-haired boy said, a cruel smile on his face. The young man continued forward towards the edge of the classroom, just at the door. In the background, a young man with forest green hair and slightly sharp emerald eyes stared at the boy with trepidation and worry. It bordered on growing hope that this young man would tell him something that would allow him to pursue his dreams. After all, it was both of their dreams to become a hero. He looked over at his old friend. He waited with bated breath as the young man gave him a smile that made him question whether or not he should trust him. You might get a quirk in your next life if you jump off the roof. The boy taunted as he prepared to leave. The young boy, who had emerald eyes, glared at the young man, his iris flashing with some form of hidden power. The boy across from him, however, the ash blonde, just gave an intimidating display of showing off his quirks in small sparks. This cowed the young man as the boy spoke up in a tone that was louder than necessary. What? You got something to say, Deku? The young man growled before walking away after the boy. Deku said nothing. As the young man walked away and into the hall, the forest green-haired young man, Deku had placed a palm over his heart. Tears fell from his eyes as he tried to figure out what and how it could have come to this point. They had once been very close friends. But now, it seemed as though the young man didn't wish to be friends with him anymore. No matter how hard he tried to get their friendship back, the young man would just constantly push him away and just beat him down for wanting to even be associated with him. It didn't help that he was born quirkless whilst the other boy had gotten a powerful fusion of his parents' quirks. Midoriya Izuku couldn't believe how his old friend was suicide baiting him. After all these years of trying to set the young man on the right path, after all the hard work of trying to push him back onto the path of a true hero, he just couldn't achieve it. The young man who had once been his old friend now turned into a harsh bully who wanted nothing more than for him to vanish. They disappeared. This bullying and belittlement had been going on for well over a decade, and Izuku could feel all the anger and frustration of his struggling to break free. He held it back because that was not what a hero would do. His dreams of heroism were still strong, but a bit hampered by the words of a young man who should have been his best friend. In all honesty, in Izuku's personal opinion, it doesn't matter who you are, he will save whoever stands in front of him, even if it ends with his own death. Sure, it might be a little dark to view how he wishes to be a hero, but at the same time, he wouldn't have it any other way. All Might had always stated that in order to become the best kind of hero, one needs to sacrifice everything they know to save the lives the hero themselves don't know. They're expected to give it their all, plus ultra, just to save even one life. And Izuku lived his life on this principle alone, but the simple fact that nobody wants to see a quirkless boy to become a hero caused him to gain a somewhat cynical viewpoint on those who were friendly with him. Sure, there were the select few within his school who were somewhat kind to him, but it was all veiled underneath wanting him to do something for them. They weren't friendly with him because they wanted to be friends with him. They were friendly with him to get something from him. It hurt him a lot to see people view him as nothing more than a useless, worthless, good-for-nothing human being. If he was even treated as a human, that was. Because of the bullying and belittlement, Izuku personally believes that those around him could live a more fulfilling life if he sacrificed himself for them to survive. Even if they weren't his friends or close with him, he wouldn't even hesitate to sacrifice his own life for them. It was just how he was. Going home was pretty lonely as well. Considering the fact that he didn't have anyone to help him with his current lifestyle, he had no one. Nobody was going to be there to provide a safe haven for him when he was constantly bullied, belittled, and constantly harassed by his peers. His mother had already long since died years ago, in a villain attack when Endeavor of all people had strayed from his normal patrol routes and entered Mizudafu. She died in a blaze of glory, having died protecting some civilians from the blazing attack of the #2 hero of Japan, using her quirk in order to redirect the particles of flame from the man's quirk onto herself. Walking home was a very quiet affair. His waterlogged notebook that had some burned scuffs on it was held in his arms. He opened the pages in order to stare at what could have been ruined or completely destroyed, meaning he'd have to rewrite it again. Mostly, all of the pages seemed waterlogged, but at the same time they weren't completely destroyed, so this meant he could just dry the paper off and probably rewrite it all in another notebook. This was the 7th notebook Bakugo had destroyed this year, and the number was no doubt going to increase the longer he stayed near the young man. Sighing to himself, Midoriya walked through an underpass. It appeared to be a large portion of road that was used for vehicles to take an alternate path from the normal freeways or side streets to get to another side of Mizudafu. The young man walked through the underpass, his eyes tearing up from the words constantly playing on repeat in his mind. Bakugo Katsuki, the young man who had made it his life's mission in order to make Midoriya's life a living hell. He didn't even know what he did wrong to have that be given to him. Yeah, jump off the roof of the building. Like that will work well with your little perfect record. Izuku grumbled to himself as he stepped over a manhole. As he walked through the rest of the underpass, his mind focused on the words he never heard the rumbling of the manhole. It rattled loudly before being slammed up into the air in a large arc heading towards the young man's back. As though he could sense the danger from behind, the young man immediately ducked his head in order to dodge the seemingly wide-open arc of the manhole flying towards him. Even though he saved his head from getting a concussion, his back was smashed into by the manhole, knocking him to the ground. I really should have taken those martial arts classes. Oh, wait, I couldn't because they were bigoted. Izuku thought to himself before course-correcting, turning around to see who had launched a large sewer grate at his back. Izuku found a large villain. They weren't flesh and bone. They were made of what appeared to be sewer sludge that caused him to GG at the sight and smell of them. Large bloodshot eyes with surprisingly large pure white teeth shone through the sludge as the villain struggled to get his head out of his, but before muttering in a tone that Izuku could hear. I didn't think that he'd be here. I need to find a place to hide, someplace where even he wouldn't think to look. The sludge villain growled to himself. Izuku made the attempt to get up from the ground, pushing the manhole cover off him. But as he tried to get back up to his feet, something in his leg felt as though it was very hurt and a large amount of pain was surging through his thigh. He didn't know whether or not it was because of the manhole or because he wasn't eating as much as he should be for a 15-year-old boy. But none of that mattered as he accidentally hissed in pain. Huh? Oh, look what we have here, a medium-sized meat suit. The sludge villain called out, moving towards the boy swiftly. The tendrils of sludge, sewer water, crawled up his legs before wrapping all around him. As he was pulled back towards the villain, Izuku could feel the snapping of something in his left thigh as he let out a shrill scream of pain before having something stuffed down his throat. His hands clawed at the sludge as he kicked and thrashed about in the sludge villain's grasp, the villain laughing and cackling the whole time. You're a real lifesaver, kid. Once I get nice and snug inside you, I will be able to avoid him. Sorry about the leg, though. Wasn't my intention. The sludge villain called out, his eyes large and smug. Izuku's struggles continued further as he tried his best in order to escape. But with his vision slowly falling and the villain cackling madly, none of them heard the sound of a man coming up from the manhole behind them. 2 large tufts of blonde hair rose out of the manhole before it was followed by a body practically created and chiseled by the gods themselves. His deep ocean blue eyes glared at the villain who was practically suffocating a random child from the street as he called out to both of them. Fear not, young man. Why? Because I am here. A familiar voice called out, causing Izuku to stay as awake as possible. DMNIT. How are you already here? I thought I lost you down there. The villain screeched. I will have you know that justice will always find all. Also, I could hear your voice from the sewers, All Might said before pulling back an arm. Texas. Smaeas. All Might yelled, thrusting his fist forward. I can't let go of this kid. And not now. The sludge villain screeched before being splattered all around the underpass. When the sludge fell off Izuku's body and fell out of his mouth, the young man couldn't help but blink blearily. Before he would pass out, he would find All Might standing there, looking as though he'd been pulled out of those videos he'd watched as a child. And with the childlike intensity of meeting his hero for the first time, he mumbled some words before passing out. All Might. Underpass. 15 minutes later, All Might, Yagi Tashinori POV until rooftop. If one were to ask Yagi Tashinori about his thoughts about his day, he would gladly state that it was relatively peaceful. That was until a sludge-like villain had decided to steal a purse of an elderly woman and rush down the road as he was getting groceries. He had buffed up at the time in order to collect the villain, and it was supposed to be his day off from work, seeing as how he'd been doing hero work for literally 3 hours so far today. But after saving the young man from the sludge villain, Yagi had managed to collect all pieces of the sludge villain and placed it into an empty soda bottle. The very same soda bottle he bought from that convenience store who had been very kind to him for the last few years. But aside from that, he was looking at the boy who was passed out on the ground not too far away from him. Off to the side of his unconscious form was a small notebook with some clear burn marks and felt slightly wet, so it was probably waterlogged. Opening it up to take a peek at the kind of notes were on this notebook titled Hero Analysis for My Future Volume 13, he was greatly surprised. As much as he wanted to question whether the young man had a very peculiar intelligence quirk, nothing seemed to point towards that. This seemed pretty much learned from a young age, if this was Volume 13 that he was currently looking through. And it even had some analysis of the new heroine, MT Lady, in the analyses as well. Taking a gander at the level of knowledge the young man held was surprising. This young man had enough information that would make a villain practically salivate at the sight of this. The questions about the young woman's hero suit being capable of stretching with her body and how it might be related to DNA-structured suit creation was very right. Yagi knew for a fact that the support course at UA High School would love to see where his mind would go from here on out if he joined. Though based on how the title presented itself, the young man wished to strive for the top, to be a hero. Grabbing a Sharpie from his BRSD pocket, he wrote his name in big bold letters across a singular page. Thinking the young man would love to have his signature for both rights of smug proof that he'd met All Might himself. Sighing to himself, the man felt the strain of holding his power form after chasing the sludge villain for literally an hour. He was running out of time to keep his powerful frame viewed. He planted the villain that he'd captured in his pocket in order to keep him from falling out, even going so far as to click the button pocket of his pants to keep the villain nice and tucked inside. Leaning over the young man, Yagi looked over any potential injuries the boy could have, lightly pressing his finger across the body in order to see if the boy would react to anything he would be doing. When he pressed his finger against the thigh of the boy, however, he heard a painful hiss as he realized the boy was most definitely hurt from the battle he had with the sludge villain. Picking him up, he gathered his other food supplies before leaping off toward the nearby building so he could transform into his weak state and walk the boy to the hospital. He didn't get the chance when the young man had immediately woken up from the amount of wind whipping at his hair. Yagi had to admit, the emerald eyes were something he wasn't prepared to see mixed with forest green hair on the boy. It was so sudden of the boy waking up that when they landed on a nearby building, it wasn't him who was breathing heavily from his quirk usage. The boy was surprisingly out of breath, and also spitting out excess sludge that had managed to enter his body from earlier when he didn't save him on time. Sorry about that, young man. I was hoping to get you to a hospital nearby, All Might said with a laugh. It's fine, All Might-san. Jay just need to see catch my breath. Izuku replied, coughing slightly. I would hope to make sure that you are fine. Can you walk on your own? All Might asked, concern in his tone. Izuku stood upright, putting his left leg in front of him to walk. He had a slight limp in the leg, but that meant he could theoretically walk his way toward a hospital or home where he could rest that leg until it's healed. Believing that his job was done, All Might prepared to jump away when Izuku called out to him. Switching to Midoriya, Izuku's POV. Hey, All Might, see, can I ask you a question? Izuku called out, causing the hero to pause. The man felt for his power to see if he would have the time to answer, and finding that he had at least 20 minutes remaining for his form, he decided to humor the child he just saved with answering his question. "All right, young man, how can I answer your question?" All Might asked curiously. Is it possible for someone without a power, without a quirk, to ever become a hero who acts in the same manner as you?" Izuku asked, looking to his hero. All Might remained silent for a moment. He'd sensed that this was a question he'd be asked. But to be asked if someone quirkless could become a hero, he had to think about how other countries viewed quirkless potential heroes. Most of the other countries in the world were ahead of the curve by allowing the quirkless to join hero academics, to allow the population of the quirkless to prove themselves. They still died far faster than normal quirked heroes, but the fact still mattered that Japan was very far behind on that department due to how they actively viewed the quirkless. He wasn't a fan of how the country viewed and treated the quirkless, but their kind of thought process on the fact of letting someone quirkless entertain the role of a hero was not really out of direct bigotry, nor was it out of kindness or pity. All Might was actually all for more quirkless heroes, but in a country like Japan, the news would have a field day for him if he ever didn't finish a villain in the flashy way that a quirked hero might. The media and hero society of Japan would literally eat him alive. So with the hesitation of a shark chasing after a seal, All Might answered the young man. "Can you give me a reason as to why you want to become a hero without a quirk, young man? Surely you know what will happen if you continue this route." All Might asked, his tone neutral but still caring. "You've always been my inspiration, sir. I've been what I personally believe as being your #1 fan. You inspired me to become a hero like you. How your mere presence can calm those around you. I want to become a hero like that," Izuku said, looking at the ground. "Then I cannot say that you shouldn't attain your dream. It may not be my choice to tell you whether or not to become a hero. It would be hypocritical if I say that anyone can be a hero in the media but tell you that you cannot in person. But in my personal opinion, it might take a few decades further for Japan itself to accept a quirkless hero within its country," All Might said, completely ignoring a strange spike of pain in his gut. "As so, I can become a hero without a quirk?" Izuku asked, hope in his eyes. Now came the sad part for All Might as he sighed. "Young man, I cannot in good conscience say that you can become a hero without a quirk. The villains every day are getting stronger. You could use your notes to defeat them, yes, but they could also use your notes to get to you." Oh, Izuku said, his hopes slowly being pushed into a waiting fire. "But you shouldn't let that get to you. I saw your notes, as I already stated earlier. You could become a support hero, but only that in this current society," All Might said, before feeling a strange pain in his gut causing him to place a palm there. Izuku remained silent for this moment, the words of the man he looked up to echoing around in his mind. It was also mixed with the words of Katsuki from earlier in the day, before he heard a voice that did not distinctly sound like the hero he admired. Looking up to see who was speaking, Izuku found a man who didn't even look like the hero he had seen, but the eyes of the man didn't change. Izuku didn't speak out his visible shock about the man's appearance. Having looked as thin as though the wind could knock him over, his eyes were wide at the man as he spoke again. "It's all right to dream, young man, but please don't let it be within the heroics course. You should enter the support course instead. With your mind, they would love you," Yagi said, as his appearance looked smaller than his buffed form. When All Might left Izuku on that rooftop, the young man couldn't help but fall to his knees. Ignoring the pain in his left thigh, Izuku felt tears that were barely being held back fall down the sides of his face. He looked off into the distance, the bright blue sky as the sun was reaching the beginning of setting over the horizon. And all Izuku could think about was the words of both All Might and Bakugo. Bakugo told him to jump. All Might told him to enter a different course. But at the same time, it felt as though both were saying the exact same thing to him. They were both telling him to take a leap of faith. Right off the edge of the rooftop and towards the ground below, where hundreds, possibly thousands of people walk daily, standing up with shaky legs, Izuku moved towards the edge of the building, his eyes having become so dull that they bordered on black in color. He climbed over the railing, staring down at the thousands of innocent beings who were blissfully ignorant of a child about to end his own life. "It's all right to dream, young man." All Might's voice rang in his mind. "Jump off the roof. Maybe then you might be a hero." Bakugo's voice rang out as well. "Do it!" Both screamed in his mind. POV Hayuru Issei. When Hayuru Issei had been sent out to gather groceries, he didn't think his mother wanted to bring him to Mizuta-fu. They had usually done their shopping in Kuo Town, the place they actually lived within, but due to some of the ingredients she wanted being out of town, it forced their hand. Hayadu had decided to check out the city a bit more, whilst his mother went about the city herself in order to gather her required ingredients. He took in the air of the city, something he wasn't really averse to, but wasn't really liking since he lived in the country. He was walking through the streets below as he thought about the current life he was living. He had been turned into a devil a week ago, and as of right now, he was out of town with his mother because of grocery shopping. Issei wanted to learn more about how to be a devil from Bucho, seeing as he wanted to just grab and squeeze what he thought would be her very squishy and soft dash. The young man drooled at the thought of doing that as he let out lecherous giggles, causing those around him to steer away from him as they thought he was crazy. No matter how hard his parents tried to curb his perverted tendencies, they couldn't stop him. After all, in his entire family tree, both of them were very perverted themselves. He hated hearing them get it on in the night, since it kept him up and corny at the same time. Not for them. That was completely disgusting, but it made him corny to at least have a girlfriend to do that with. Sue him. He's a pervert who has dreams of having a HRM and becoming a HRM king. He had seen a lot of really good-looking girls as he walked through Mizuta-fu, and they actually looked at him as though he were a potential love interest too. It was so great. Issei had also seen the heroes moving about the city as well. He really liked MT Lady because she could increase her as she used her quirk. It was way better than his own quirk empathic sight. He could feel the vast quantities of emotions in a singular person, and the entire city was chock full of different emotions that filtered throughout their daily lives. Issei was walking down the road before seeing a silhouette in the air on top of a nearby building. At first he thought it was a hero, probably preparing to take off into the sky and try and see a lay of the land through flight. Though, when he looked at the silhouette closer, having to place a hand in front of his eyes to keep him from going blind from the sun, he immediately realized that the silhouette was not actually a hero, but a kid. "Wait a minute. What the hell?" Issei called out, causing a small ruckus nearby. Some people looked at him in confusion before looking up and finding nothing. They all shrugged before moving about their days before Issei entered the building as fast as he could. He used the Devil Piece's ability to grant him an upgrade in an opponent's territory, the pawn's ability to promote itself. He gave himself the speed of a knight and ran up the stairs as fast as he could, wanting nothing more than to reach the kid as fast as he could. By the time he reached the rooftop, Issei found the kid wearing a black gakurin that was most assuredly burned and looked slightly scuffed. Running towards the young man, Issei watched as the boy moved forwards to fall. Jumping through the air in order to catch the boy and keep him from falling off the side of the building to his death, Issei used every ounce of his power to grab him in time. He felt his hand manage to grab the boy's ankle, soliciting a cry of pain from him before hauling him up. He felt as though the boy was incredibly light, which also meant that he wasn't being fed enough as he hauled the boy onto the rooftop again. Issei panted heavily to himself as he kept the boy pinned beneath himself as he stared into the dull, emerald eyes that stared at him with confusion, fear, and what appeared to be self-loathing. "Are you crazy, kid? Why would you do this?" Issei yelled, holding the boy's arms. "Who are you? And why are you yelling at me?" The boy asked as Issei literally growled to himself. "I'm not yelling at you because I hate you, kid. I'm yelling because you try to jump off a 20-story building. You clearly have no sense of self-preservation." Issei retorted as the boy chuckled. "Wouldn't you like to know?" The boy mumbled as Hayadu just took a deep breath. "I'm going to ask you one time. and I need you to give me an actual answer besides half answers and dodging the question. Why did you jump? Issei asked, holding the boy's shoulders. It seemed as though the clenching of his hands on the boy's shoulders caused tears to all in droves. The boy continued to cry as his shoulders shivered and trembled before the words left his mouth. And no, but they didn't want me. As so, and nobody wants me. I thought. The boy stuttered through his answer before Issei pulled him into a hug. The boy shivered in his embrace, and at the same time it seemed as though he leaned into it more. The tears came down faster than before as he openly sobbed into his shoulder as Issei focused on trying to get the kid back to normal, or whatever normal was for him. Patting the boy's back, Issei quietly pulled out his phone before messaging his mom about finding someone trying to commit to something that couldn't be undone. He didn't want to say the kid was trying to commit suicide just yet. His mother would be immediately alarmed and head towards them as fast as possible. The last thing he wanted this boy to be was fearful of an adult. Right now, he needed someone who could hear him out. Okay, now that you've had some time to calm down, can you tell me what happened to make you want to do that? My name is Hayado Issei, by the way. Issei said, introducing himself at the same time. Emilia Izuku, and I've had a bad 15 years of life. Izuku said as Issei nodded. I can see that. So let me guess. You're quirkless and was told to commit suicide? Issei asked, as Izuku blinked at him in shock before nodding. Okay, I can work with this. Something else had to have happened for you to actually commit to this. Because my quirk is telling me that it was a whole collection of things happening to you today to do this. Issei said, as Izuku blinked at him again. Why your quirk? He asked as Issei nodded. My quirk's called empathic sight. Allows me to see the vast emotions within someone, and let me tell you this, you have a lot of bottled up rage and sorrow within you. The sorrow actually breaking free at the moment. Issei said before clarifying. Asterisk sniff asterisk that's pretty cool. Izuku replied as Issei chuckled. Don't try and take the conversation away from the question. Please, tell me why you thought this was the right course of action. Issei said, lightly punching his arm. It was just a normal day. Went to school, was bullied, beaten, and suicide baited. Then I was attacked by a villain made of sludge. After that I was saved by All Might. He brought me up here. Would try to get me to a hospital before I woke up. But we got to talking, and he said I'd be better off in the support course at UA. Izuku said, rubbing his left arm nervously. I mean, is there a reason why he said that? Issei asked curiously. In my notes. I write notes about anyone and everyone I've met with strange quirks. I like learning new things about quirks. Izuku said, rubbing the back of his head. I see. You know, you could just get a license to be a quirk counselor in order to create better heroes than the ones we currently have. Issei said, as Izuku shook his head. I want to become a quirkless hero. The very first one in history for Japan. Izuku said as Issei sighed. You and I both know that Japan wouldn't allow that to happen. Issei said, as Izuku looked at him. So, does this mean you don't think I could become one? Izuku asked, tears building up in his eyes. No, I think you could become a great hero with your notes, as well as training to be a quirkless hero. The closest thing to a quirkless hero is the underground hero Eraserhead, after all. Issei said, giving an example of a close, quirkless hero. Yeah, but he levels the playing field, so everyone in the fight is quirkless. Izuku said, pulling his legs to his chest. Issei heard Izuku hiss to himself when he pulled his left thigh to his chest. Deciding to check up on the young man himself, he pressed a thumb to the skin of the left thigh in the gakuren he was wearing. Izuku let out a slightly louder hiss of pain as Issei decided to feel around for anything that might be distended from the skin surface, and finding a bump on the top of the thigh, Issei glanced at Izuku. All right, kid, from what I can feel, your leg has a snapped thigh bone. I'm going to push it back into place, and I'll carry you down the stairs so we can get to my mom. Issei said, as Izuku tilted his head. Your mom? He asked, confused. I messaged her earlier. She's on her way to pick me up, though she will probably be more worried about you. Issei said, helping Izuku to his feet. He then picked the boy up and carried him on his back, Izuku leaning over the young man's back as Hayao held his legs. Izuku's face flushed crimson at the contact, but decided to just eat the humiliation of being carried by another young man as they walked through the halls. As they went down the stairs, Issei decided to ask him one final question. "By the way, I've got a question for you, little guy," Issei said, as Izuku grunted slightly in pain. What is *URG? It? Izuku asked, grunting. "What's your favorite thing about a girl's body? Their dash? Their butts? Their thighs?" Issei asked, as Izuku just stared at him from on his shoulder. What are you talking about?" Izuku asked as Issei sighed. "What part of a girl's body do you find more RSNG? Their dash, their butt, or their thighs?" Issei asked, as Izuku blushed crimson. "Hey, don't hide behind my back. Tell me your answer, kid." Izuku mumbled something unintelligible before Issei called out again. "I didn't hear you," Issei said, in a teasing manner. "I like their dash." Izuku mumbled, his face still crimson. "A fellow Kinesia," Issei happily yelled. Mizutefu, Shizuoka Prefecture, Japan, 2265. In Mizutefu, they told me I was hollow because I was corkless. They were wrong. I wasn't empty. I was a pressurized chamber. Every insult and every burn was just something else I had to bottle up. Now that I'm here, the seals are finally starting to crack, and for the first time in my life, I'm terrified of what happens when I finally let it all out. By the time the two young men reached the bottom of the staircase, Issei pulled out his phone. He was forced to put Izuku on the ground so he could hobble over to a nearby bench so he could call his mother. When she answered the phone, she asked him where he currently was at the moment, and when Issei informed him about what had happened between him and Izuku, he made it sound like he wanted a little brother. Miki Hayao wasn't a woman who answered her son's desires whenever he wanted, but to hear that he wanted a little brother wasn't something that was on her mind. It wouldn't be until near evening that Miki would find them at the old building slated for deconstruction. She found Izuku leaning against Issei as they hobbled over to her, and the woman's motherly instincts took over as she rushed over to Izuku. She could easily see the fact that he wasn't eating as much as he should have been and immediately gave him something to eat as she helped both him and her son in her car. It would be a long drive for the trio to get back to Kuo Town, especially with the fact that they were getting something else as well in this ride into Mizutefu. So, as I'm sure my son has already stated, my name is Hayao Miki. That is my son Hayao Issei. He is a massive pervert. I've been trying to cull that side of him for years. Not sure if it's worked or made it worse. Miki said, introducing herself as she drove down the road. It's surprising to be sure, but in nothing I see can't handle. Izuku replied from the back seat. You're adorable. What's your name, young man? I'm not sure if my son gave it to me during the text he's been rapid-firing me today. Miki asked as Izuku nodded. My name is Midoriya Izuku. I live in Mizutefu and have been for the last few years. Izuku said, as Miki smiled at him. Well, can you tell me what your home life is? I would like to speak to the person who has been forcing you to starve yourself. Miki asked, as Izuku went quiet. Miss Hayao, I'm an orphan, Izuku said, as Miki stopped the car abruptly. You're what? She asked, her tone extremely cold. I've been an orphan for the last 3 years, Izuku said, looking scared of the woman. What happened? If I'm going to adopt you by the end of the day, I need details. Miki said as Izuku sighed. It was a villain attack. I was at school at the time. My mom was out grocery shopping that day. She was killed defending some civilians from Endeavor's flaming bursts. Izuku said, looking at the floor of the car sadly. The rest of the ride out of Mizutefu was filled with silence as Miki tried to come up with some form of apology. And while Izuku knew she didn't mean anything bad by her getting details of what happened, it still hurt to think about even after so many years passing. He leaned his head against the window of the car, the throbbing pain of his thigh reminding him that he had a broken femur bone that was in desperate need of healing. But for some reason, the area on his thigh felt extremely inflamed, as though something hot was trying to cause a ruckus in his leg. Eventually, though, Izuku fell asleep from the pain in his leg. Issei had been watching Izuku for the last 20 minutes, waiting until his breathing evened out before glancing to his mom, who had done the same with him. Neither said a word, but they both knew for a fact that Izuku wasn't going to be returning back to the very place that caused him so much pain and misery. Taking a deep breath, all before letting it out in a heavy sigh, Mickey spoke up first between mother and son. "ISC, can you tell me exactly what you think about him? I need to know because of how your quirk works." Mickey asked, looking to her son. "Mom, he has a lot of repressed anger and sadness. From what I could see with my quirk, it's only a matter of time before he snaps either in sadness or fury," Issei said, looking uncharacteristically concerned. "All right, I believe this means he will need a lot of therapy," Mickey mumbled as Issei nodded. "A lot doesn't even bridge the gap of how much he's repressed, Mom. It's almost as though, if I can make a similar distinction, it's almost as though the sadness is the cooling agent to a nuclear power plant," Issei said as Mickey blinked in confusion. "Issei, why did you use that analogy? You're not really known to have a very intelligent mind," Mickey asked as Issei blushed. "Just because I don't get good grades doesn't mean I don't retain that information," Issei retorted indignantly. For the rest of the drive, it was mostly silent aside from the slight grunts from Izuku's sleeping form. Issei was becoming worried about the boy since his leg seemed to be having a strange glow come from it, and when he took a look, the glow was somehow gone. Issei knew for a fact that he wasn't smart, but at the same time, he couldn't deny what he had seen. Did Izuku have a quirk, but wasn't able to know what it was because it was passive? No, that couldn't be. He specifically stated that he was quirkless. There was no way the boy would lie to him. His quirk made it impossible for people to lie to him. Staying quiet about it for right now, Issei was going to need to probably have the guest bedroom revamped. Currently, the only person living there with him, his mom and his dad, was himself. But he had been seeing that girl from the other day in Kuo Town. The last time he'd seen her was 2 days ago, and she was with freed cells in and excommunicated. Priest from a church who had killed his would-be contract. Issei was still furious as to how that night ended 2 days ago, with him being forced to leave Asia all on her own without any form of help. Kuo Town, late evening. When the moon was slowly coming over the mountains surrounding Kuo Town, Mickey stopped in front of the hospital. She wasn't too keen on making sure that Izuku was healing without medical knowledge to assist him with the healing effort of his injured leg. Both Hyidus helped him out of the car and walked him into the hospital that immediately went to assist in getting him to a doctor who could help. For at least 14 minutes, the two Hyidus would sit still in the hospital waiting for any kind of news in order to figure out how to help the boy they were taking in. Mickey was pacing through the lobby as she waited for the go-ahead from the nurses or doctors to visit the boy again. Issei was actually contacting his friends at Kuo Academy about the situation at hand, hoping beyond a shadow of a doubt that they could help with this situation. This also gave the young man to actually think about the glow he'd seen in the car from the mirror. The glow from Izuku's leg wasn't something he'd seen before, much less from any of the stray devils he'd fought in the past, and he had helped in the defeat of at least 3 of them. But none of them held a power that could seemingly glow in a center where pain was originally centered around. The simple fact that Izuku was not even screaming in agony throughout the whole trip to Kuo Town proved how much tolerance to pain he had. It wasn't a good look for a boy who was at least 2 years younger than him. The boy was Kaniko's age, and he already had this high of pain tolerance. This was not healthy, and even Issei knew this. He got a few messages from his friends that stated that they either were too busy at the moment or couldn't make it. Issei just replied that he wanted to have a question with them in person. That was it, before he put his phone away. By the time the 14 minutes passed fully, a doctor came out with a thoroughly confused expression on his face as he looked at the blood work for the boy. Mickey rushed the doctor with concern etched into her features as she pleaded with the man to give her everything she needs to know. "Doctor, is he going to be all right?" Mickey practically yelled. "He's going to be fine. In fact, he's going to be better than fine within the next hour or so. We've got our best healing quirks on hand in order to heal the damage. He's lucky you both got him here as fast as you did." From what we were seeing, his body was actively trying to reset the bone back in a place on its own. The doctor said, as Mickey and Issei blinked at him in confusion. Doc, he doesn't have a quirk," Issei said, as the doctor nodded. That may be true from what we were able to gather from his other doctor's notes. But when we did a BLD work test on him whilst we were waiting, we found something truly strange. The doctor said, handing the papers over. Mickey and Issei stared at the papers in confusion as they read them. On the papers, it clearly stated that Izuku had a quirk factor that was at the moment completely recessive but on the cusp of manifesting. The two glanced at one another before remembering Issei's analogy in the car heading to the hospital in the first place. Their expressions became grave as they spoke to the doctor. "Doctor, my quirk allows me to see the emotions radiating off of people," Issei said, as the man nodded. "That sounds like an appealing quirk that could be used to save lives," the doctor said, as Issei chuckled. "I know, but the problem is, when I found him, he was in a very bad place mentally and physically. He had already tried to kill himself via jumping off a rooftop, and he had a far worse-looking injury to his thigh. How did he heal in that time, but only physically?" Issei asked as the doctor smiled. "It seems as though from the blood work, the quirk factor manifested in the art of healing his body for the moment. From what I believe, it will begin to manifest more clearly in the coming week, and I will ask that you bring him here so we can get a full read on what it will become," the doctor said, his glasses glinting in the light. "But I would like to state that the previous doctor who gave these results, he was committing to malpractice, using a fact such as toe joints in the foot to state that someone is quirkless has been disproven 300 times over in the last couple of years. We'll look at the blood work for someone to either have a quirk or not." The doctor finished before leaving. Mickey and Issei stared at the papers in shock before Mickey placed them in her purse. She will not be letting Midoriya go now that he was within her grasp, nor will she allow him to be placed in the system. He will not survive for very much longer with both his current mindset, and how late his quirk is going to manifest will be much harder for him to grasp later on in this place. Sighing to themselves, the two prepared to head down the hall, only to find Izuku limping slightly towards them with a confused expression on his face as he looked at their expressions of shock and awe. "How are you able to walk around, Midoriya?" Issei asked, rushing to him. "The doctors said that in my leg was pretty much healed before they got to me. They used healing quirks to push the bone back, in the right place before closing the fracture. I shouldn't be on my leg for very long this week, though," Izuku said, as Issei nodded. "Well, how would you like to meet Goro?" Mickey asked, as Izuku tilted his head in confusion. "Who's Goro?" Izuku asked as Mickey giggled. "That's my husband. We live not far from Kuo Academy. Though I think we should SWCH your schools if you're going to live with us," Mickey said, as Izuku nodded. "Anything to get away from Aldera," Izuku mumbled as Issei heard it, but didn't voice a question about it. Hyudu household. Early morning, the next day. The next morning, Izuku found himself in a home that most definitely wasn't his own. He sat upright in the bed, his eyes raking over everything inside the dull room before the previous night's events came back to him in a moment of full clarity. He had nearly let Katsuki win by actually following his advice in jumping off a rooftop and praying for a quirk in his next life. Taking shaky breaths, he stood up from the bed as he tested to see if his leg was fine, only to find that he didn't feel a dull throb in the leg anymore, and believing that he was fine now, he walked around the room. He planted a hand on the wall as he felt its cold exterior. When he compared it to the visible warmth he had from the bed, he was confused about the fact that he was able to sleep in a very cold room. It felt as though it was below freezing. He walked over to the door and opened it before entering the hall. Entering the nearby bathroom, he began to do a morning ritual he'd done for the last 10 years of his life. He brushed his teeth, took a shower, put his clothes back on before walking down the hall, as though he hadn't broken a femur bone just the previous day. Walking down the staircase, he heard whispering coming from the kitchen. Moving towards the kitchen as quietly as possible, he could make out the words of the Hyudu family talking to one another in hushed whispers. "Okay, so what are we supposed to tell him?" Goro asked curiously. "I don't know. Mom was the one who wanted to adopt him," Issei replied, his tone in a whisper. "Why are you whispering?" Izuku should be waking up soon. Mickey Whisper yelled at Issei. Just because he might be waking up soon doesn't mean that I want him to hear about what you've been planning. Issei growled as Goro chuckled. What? Are you concerned about your place as the only boy we were ever able to have? Goro asked, curiosity and happiness in his expression. No, I'm concerned with the fact that we might need to have a bigger house soon. Issei retorted, blushing slightly. Are you that embarrassed with us adopting him and replacing his last name with ours? Mickey asked, concern on her expression. I don't want everyone at Kuo Academy thinking that he's a pervert like me. Issei said, looking at the table. Son, are you scared for his time being there to be treated in the same manner as yourself? Goro asked, confused. Dad, I'm a notorious pervert at Kuo Academy. I literally peep on the kendo girls when they're changing. Imagine having someone claiming to be my adopted brother appearing out of nowhere. They'll try and either kill him on sight, or they'd do unscrupulous things to his mentality that is already suffering. Issei explained as Mickey smiled sadly. I didn't know you viewed yourself as an older brother already. Mickey giggled, her tone sad though. Mom, you didn't see how close I was to dropping him. I had barely managed to catch his ankle, and that was with my pushing my body to its limits just to reach him. Issei said, as Mickey blinked at her son. You're afraid that the moment you lose sight of him, he might try again. Goro blurted out, his tone soft but worried. Ichi was so scared, Dad. He almost died wanting nothing more than to have it end. I saw his thoughts with my quirk. Issei said, clenching his fists under the table. Suddenly, as though he could feel a presence behind him, Issei turned around in a snapping motion. Izuku visibly flinched from how fast Issei turned around, finding Izuku standing there, tears in his eyes as he watched the trio argue about his place here. Issei and Mickey had talked about bringing him, and whilst Goro was fully on board with bringing him to Kuo Academy to learn alongside him. For the first time in his life, Izuku had actually felt wanted instead of being told to leave others alone, and those hurtful words Kakin told him just yesterday. Sniffling in complete shock, he fell to his knees, causing the trio to leap at him in worry. They pulled him into a hug before noticing something off about his body. He felt incredibly warm to the touch, not enough to be a fever, but enough to feel it through his clothes. Issei was the one who looked to his mother as his father brought Izuku out of the kitchen so that they could talk about the living arrangements within the home as well as his rules. Issei was left inside the kitchen with his mother, a small smile on his face at how well Izuku was getting along with his dad. It's starting, Mickey mumbled. Yeah, how strong do you think it'll be? Issei asked. From what the papers said, his parents' quirks were relatively weak. A minor form of telekinesis called attraction of small objects, and a relatively weak form of pyrokinesis, though it was called fire breath. Mickey said, pulling the papers out. He felt very warm a moment ago. You think his quirk is showing itself right now? Issei asked as Mickey nodded. It'll probably reveal itself as a mere space heater to keep him warm. Though now that you mention it, it really feels cold in here. Mickey said before noticing. You can say that again. It feels as though I'm in the polar ice caps. Issei said, shivering slightly. Well, let's just make sure that when he eventually manifests his quirk, that he quickly learns how to use it effectively without hurting anyone. Mickey said, as Issei nodded in agreement. In the background, Izuku was shown happily watching TV with Goro as the man showed him his favorite movies. Izuku was so enthralled with the movie that he had no clue that his entire body was shimmering with some form of mist that looked similar to sweat. Kuo Academy Gate, early morning, 2265. Mom thinks he's a space heater, but she isn't seeing what I'm seeing. With my quirk, Izuku doesn't look like a scared kid anymore. He looks like a star that's forgotten how to shine and is starting to collapse instead. There's a pressure coming off him that's beginning to warp the air, and I'm terrified that if he finally snaps, there won't be enough of Kuo Town left to bury. After the weekend was over, Izuku can be seen standing in front of Issei. The young man watched as Izuku stiffly moved his arms around in the new uniform he was given in order to go to Kuo Academy with the young man. Issei was smiling at Izuku, since the young man himself was wearing a small emerald green t-shirt underneath the blazer of the uniform that he'd gotten for him. Issei may have fudged the age of Izuku so that he could enter Kuo Academy, but at the same time it was worth it so that he could teach Izuku how to live within a school primarily consisting of women. He'd watched Izuku over the weekend, how the boy seemingly grew in power over the day. It seemed as though his quirk was manifesting through a means of thermal heat, ing all the heat in the area and pushing it all deep within his body. Now Issei wasn't one to focus on these kinds of things, but he was really worried about what would happen to Izuku should the heat become too much for him to handle. The young boy in front of him looked kind of heated, a small blush on his face as he struggled to figure out why he was going to school again. Hi Uda-san, can you tell me why I'm going to Kuo Academy? I am not even 15. Izuku asked, looking to the young man in confusion. Because I know that you're smarter than you look. That junior high school you talked to me about yesterday was hindering your potential as a scholar. So, I decided to fudge your record a bit with some assistance with Bucho. You're now 15 years old and a transfer student to Kuo Academy. Issei said, puffing his chest in pride. Okay, but isn't Kuo Academy an all-girls school? Izuku asked as Issei chuckled. Kuo Academy started to allow the opposite gender into their school 2.5 years ago. You'll be fine, Issei said, waving off his concern. All right, but what classes do I have? Izuku asked, concerned. That is something you'll be talking to the student council president about. She's the one who sets up the classes one will have in the school. Issei said as Izuku nodded. What is her name? Izuku asked, curious. Her name is Sauna Shirtorai. She is someone who has a very high ranking in the school. So don't get on her nerves. She doesn't really like me and my friends anyway. Issei said, as Izuku blinked at him in confusion. Your friends? Oh no. Did I keep you away from your friends? Izuku asked, in both concern and fear, his hands moving to his head in a fearful way. No. You didn't keep them away from me, buddy. I just decided to take a break from them, is all. I may be a pervert and they're my friendly perverts, but I can use a day or two to get away from them. Issei said, as Mickey entered the hallway. Oh, you look so handsome. You're going to be a marvel within that school. I just know it. Mickey said, pride in her tone. She also had placed her palms on both cheeks of Izuku's face, squishing them as Izuku stared at her in confusion. His eyes glanced down at his uniform before looking up at her again with confusion, and before he could make a rebuttal on her words, she shushed him with a finger to his mouth. And instead of giving words of rebuttal, she shooed him and Issei outside of the small home, and the two began their trek towards the school that Issei had gone to. The walk was silent and filled with a slight chill in the air, Izuku in a lot of the morning heat to keep himself warm unconsciously. Issei himself had to use the passive heat from his sacred gear in order to keep himself warm in the early winter air. Small clouds of white steam left the two's mouths as they walked through the streets of Kuo town, Izuku's wide, slightly dulled emerald eyes taking in the small town. The young man watched as the people in the town were happy with one another, some people going out on dates whilst others were rushing to their place of work. So, Hayudu-san, what are your plans for me today? Izuku asked, stuttering a little bit. Well, today, I plan on taking you to Kuo Academy. Then if the school allows it, I'll show you around school. Show you the clubs you could join in order to make some new friends and many other things. Issei said, a happy smile on his face. If you say so. Izuku stuttered out before holding onto his backpack with a death grip. Issei watched Izuku for the rest of their walk to the school grounds. He watched Izuku's palm turn white from how he held onto his backpack strap. The boy was most assuredly scared in this very moment, but was pushing himself to appear braver. Though he had a chuckle to himself, watching the normally meek and timid boy slowly begin to get some confidence in his step before they arrived at the gates of the campus. Issei was about to walk through the gates when he felt something grab onto his sleeve. Turning to see Izuku staring up at him with hesitation in his eyes, Izuku spoke up. I'm not feeling so good right now. Izuku mumbled as Issei smiled. Don't worry, little guy. The girls and boys here won't mess with you. Issei said as Izuku blinked at him. They won't? Like they won't hurt me because I'm quirkless? Izuku asked as Issei cringed slightly. They might make some comments, sure, but last time I checked they only hurt me. And that's because I'm a PPNGTM, Issei said, proudly puffing his chest out. What's a PPNGTM? Izuku questioned, his expression scrunched in confusion. You'll learn more about that later. For now, we should enter the school grounds before class starts, Issei said, ushering Izuku into the grounds. For a long while nothing happened. Izuku was walking next to Hayato before he heard it. The whispers of the other students, most of them blinking at Izuku in confusion before they shrugged their shoulders, though some of the girls were very livid. Especially the girls wearing those strange kendo uniforms that really accentuated their bodies. Wait, what was he doing? He was openly leering at those girls without even apologizing. He's becoming a pervert like Hayato? Does that make him a PPNGTM like Hayato called himself? As Izuku was thinking these terrible thoughts, Issei noticed Izuku's sorrow growing. He watched as the heat around him returned to the surrounding area. Letting out a small huff, he pulled Izuku to himself, feeling the cold skin of his body for a second before smiling. He can work with Izuku, slowly getting confidence in himself before his quirk awakens/manifests. Though he has to wonder what will it do? Kuo Academy Hall's student council room. When Issei dropped him off at the student council's room, Izuku stayed near the door. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions that he was trying to figure out how to calm down before meeting whoever this Sauna Shirtorai woman was. Raising his arm to knock on the door, it was slammed open as a woman who looked very mature in his eyes smacked a dirty blonde-haired young man out of the room with a fury in her eyes. Izuku had stepped out of the way so that he couldn't get caught in the conflict appearing before himself. He couldn't help but pay attention to it, though. For the last time, Saji, stop begging Kaishu to marry you. You're still a year younger than her. The tall, black-haired woman screeched as the young man ran away. Izuku watched the young woman fix her apparel before turning to see him. The moment her heterochromatic eyes laid themselves bare on him, Izuku couldn't help but blush at her appearance, her hair all frizzed out from her fury and how she was fixing her appearance. He liked this version of her, for some reason. The young woman watched his gaze as it stayed perfectly on her face and eyes, finding that he isn't acting perverted very good in her eyes. Hello there, young man. Are you perhaps lost? Shouldn't you be in junior high right about now? The young woman asked as Izuku shook his head. I am the new student, a transfer. Midoriya, Izuku. Izuku replied, stuttering through it all and bowing. Ah, so you're the transfer student. I apologize for my actions earlier. Probably scared you with that, huh? The woman said, fixing her appearance swiftly and apologizing to him. And no, it's fine. You were just doing your job. I came here for my schedule. Izuku said before asking. Yes, come in. Kaicho will be happy to see another male student, especially one who isn't perverted, the young woman stated, her tone soft but filled with authority. Walking into the student council's room, Izuku found himself surrounded by bookshelves that were filled with, well, books. He stared at each one as they held different forms of class lessons for future events that he probably won't ever find out about. Moving towards one of the recliners in the room, he sat down in one and immediately felt himself sink into the leather of the seat. The woman in the desk in front of him was rather short, with black hair, stylized in a bob cut with glasses that covered her violet eyes. Did Izuku have a kinkai for girls wearing glasses, or was that just him? So you are Midoriya Izuku. Can you tell me about why your records were forged? Sauna Shirtorai questioned, her tone heavy with suspicion. Hidesan said that he and his bucho had fudged them, stating that it'd be better if I came to this school instead of finishing off junior high. Hayato said that my previous school was not letting my intelligence flourish. Izuku replied, trying to be as cooperative as possible. I see. Anyway, that was all I needed to know. Here is your schedule. Your first class is Class 1A within the first floor. The teacher is expecting you. Sauna set her eyes, watching him closely as he stood up to leave with the schedule. Thank you so much. I hope I don't disturb you in the future," Izuku said, bowing before running away. When he left through the door, Sauna felt the energy within him, her eyes changing from a violet color to a cerulean blue. Her expression was laced with suspicion as she glanced at her subordinate. "Tsubaki, have Rias be prepared for a talk. Two things are going to be her center of speech. One, why she allowed this 14-year-old boy into Kuo Academy. And two, his power is coming in way too fast. He'll be manifesting a quirk far before the day is over," Sauna said, cleaning her glasses of fog. "Of course, my king," Tsubaki said before teleporting away. As Tsubaki left the student council's office, Sauna stared down at the recliner chair. Sitting in the place where Izuku had once been sitting was a perfect charred version of himself, though not entirely full. It showed his back, arms, and legs, though she did notice a strange indentation in the seat, as though he had a third leg that she completely ignored because she didn't believe it was anything else rather than her eyes deceiving her. "Midoriya, Izuku, you're lucky that I have filled out my peerage, because your power is something I would most assuredly want for myself," Sauna muttered before getting back to work. First PRD, early morning. When Izuku first arrived at his first class of the day, he was filled with a crud ton of hesitation. He stood at the door between the class and the hallway. His fear of rejection and the fear of being bullied once again in class again made him feel particularly worried. In his last school, the bullying stopped just after a ruthless beatdown of both his mental and physical forms. Izuku hated being bullied. It made him feel less than human. Taking a deep breath, he knocked on the door in preparation for an all-consuming hatred to be pointed directly at him. The door opened to reveal a woman who looked motherly in appearance before letting him come inside. Walking through the door, he was surprised to see a bunch of students who were primarily female, and each of them were staring at him in both confusion and trepidation. Izuku wasn't sure what the trepidation was all about, but he decided to give it his all in order to not feel as though he were pushing them to hate him almost this early. Taking a deep breath once more, he spoke in a soft but loud tone for the entire class to hear. "And my name is Midoriya Izuku. I come from Izudafu in Shizuoka Prefecture. I hope that we all get along without having to go to extremes," Izuku said, bowing in nervousness. "All right, Midoriya, you can take a seat over by Kaneko-chan. She's over by the window. You'll be in the seat next to her on the left," the teacher said as Izuku nodded and rushed over to the seat as fast as possible. Once he was fully seated, the teacher droned on about their lesson for the day. Izuku quickly finding himself in his academic zenless zone as he focused on completing notes and assignments early for the teacher to grade about in the next few days. As the morning ticked onward, with classes passing by in what felt like an endless set of time, Izuku found himself panting by the end of one of his final classes before lunch. The air around him had suddenly began to feel as though it were suffocating him. His uniform felt extremely tight on his body, and when looking down at himself, he felt very lightheaded. When looking over at his seatmate, he found Kaneko sleeping on her desk with a cute expression on her face. Izuku was overcome with such a profound sense of duty that he decided to stay near her so that nobody would disturb her. Not because he liked her, no, but because she looked adorable while sleeping, and he wanted to make sure that nobody disturbed her from her current nap. And as time passed by before lunch was slowly encroaching on him, Izuku noticed something strange about the rest of the classroom as a whole. The other students were complaining about how it was getting to freeze in the room. Izuku blinked in confusion at that. It felt as though he were standing in the middle of a furnace without any problems aside from feeling extremely lightheaded. He was about to stand up from his seat when a profound sense of confusion hit him like a wave of the ocean, knocking him over. The moment he stood up from his desk seat, he collapsed to the ground, panting heavily as sweat fell off his body in droves. The class noticed his pained expression as they all rushed to him, calling for a teacher or someone with something to help. A couple of older students entered the room with confused expressions on their faces, one with brown hair and eyes, and another with pink hair and blue eyes as they rushed over to Izuku's position on the ground as he was laid out starfish style. His eyes were half-lidded as he felt the strangest sensation of heat encompassing his entire body. It felt as though the furnace had transformed to a bonfire that just wouldn't turn off. That was when he heard it. "Everybody, get out of the way." It was Hayudu. Izuku looked at Hayudu before finding the young man, pushing everyone else away. He grabbed onto his smaller body before picking him up and rushing him out of the room, fear evident on his expression that it caused Izuku to groan out in pain, and Izuku spoke up. "Ugh, it hurts. What's going on? Issei-san?" Izuku asked, his half-lidded eyes squinting to see Issei. "Hey, little brother, I need you to be very calm when I say this, okay?" Issei asked, as Izuku nodded very lethargically. "Okay, so your doctor back in Mizutofu? Yeah, he lied about you," Issei said, causing Izuku to blink at him in confusion. "What are you even talking about?" Izuku asked, the heat in his core feeling massive. "Your doctor said that you were quirkless, right?" Issei asked as Izuku nodded in agreement. "He lied, Izuku. You have a quirk, and it's manifesting right now. The doctor lied to you. But that would mean everything I suffered was for nothing." Izuku groaned in pain. By the time the two reached outside of the school and onto the campus grounds, Issei placed Izuku on the cool pavement, and the young man could easily see the steam coming off his body in waves. It was enough that Issei could barely see Izuku's body anymore. Izuku had soon turned over on his side as he clenched his stomach and chest with so much pain and vitriol that he could only think of the words everyone had told him growing up. Issei's cries for help and assistance were left to be muffled as Izuku rolled over to his hands and knees, panting heavily. "You're quirkless? That means you broke our promise." Katsuki's voice rang out. "You should probably give up." The doctor's voice rang in his mind. "If you want a quirk so bad, there might be a way for you to do it. Jump off the roof and pray you get a quirk in your next life." Katsuki's voice rang out once more. "Can one become a hero without a quirk?" "No, I should think not. It's all right to dream, young man, but sometimes it's better to know one's place in all this." All Might's voice echoed in his mind. Izuku's body felt as though the heat was reaching a fever pitch, and the young man felt as though his body was about to burst. That was until the feelings he had about his life, the life he'd lived for over a decade, the lies of the doctor, the bullying and abuse of both his peers and teachers hit him hard. The feeling that was at the top of it, however, was a feeling he never knew how to deal with. Anger, hatred, and most of all, fury. Izuku couldn't think of anything else to do before he began to growl in pain. The growling grew worse and worse until the steam fluttering over his body continued its high climb in temperature. It had started at a measly 5 degrees Celsius. The temperature then began to climb higher and higher until it reached a maximum of 1,500 degrees, and Izuku could feel his uniform beginning to warp and melt away from his body. Scars of old began to reveal themselves on his chest and back as he panted heavily through the steam before he let out a cry to the heavens itself. Through the steam, Issei could see 2 glowing green iris glaring up towards the school, all before a massive beam of flames blasted out from the boy's position in the middle of the courtyard and straight into a pillar towards the sky. It was basically a beacon to any and all heroes in the area as to what was happening, and Issei was at a loss for words before he watched Izuku slowly stand up through the fog of steam. His green eyes glowed in the steam, giving his form a strange but hilariously villain-like appearance all before he slammed his fist into the ground. The ground cracked from the sheer force of the attack, spiderweb cracks splintering out from where Izuku stood. And when the steam and flames finally gave up, Izuku was seen standing there, his eyes glowing, but his hair having transformed into a burning emerald flame that flickered towards the sky before the heat in the area began to be ed away and towards the bonfire that was Izuku's head. The boy was completely lost in the act of having manifested his quirk, and Issei looked towards Rias and the others who were coming towards them. They had sensed the massive spike in energy in the middle of the courtyard, and Sona was coming too as the woman had created a barrier around the school, whilst the rest of her peerage was erasing the memories of those who were watching this. By the time Rias and her peerage arrived next to Issei, Rias glanced at Issei. You had better tell me what happened. Rias growled, his quirks manifesting. Issei said, urgently, okay, I get that, but why is it so powerful? And shouldn't he have manifested it at the age of 4? Rias yelled over the roaring flames. Yes, but his doctor lied. The original doctor for him said that Izuku was quirkless. So for his entire life, he'd gone without using his quirk once. It wasn't until recently that my mom and I found out that he had a quirk from an actually good doctor. Issei retorted. His body can't handle the level of heat it's producing. He's going into a full thermonuclear meltdown. Sona called out after arriving. What? Issei called out. He's undergoing a nuclear meltdown, though it's centered in thermal dynamics. He's taking in too much heat. We need to cool him down in a way that allows his body to catch up and fix itself to match the level of heat it's producing. Sona explained. How in the hell do we do that? We're not nuclear scientists. Issei yelled. What if we gave him an evil piece? Rias asked, concern rising over the second. Are you serious? You're planning on giving him even more power than he's already got? Sona yelled. It's an idea at least. For all we know, the piece I give him could help him gain the durability and resistance needed in order to survive this manifestation. Rias retorted as Sona stopped to think. Theoretically, it could work, but that would be placing a massive amount of trust in Ijuka's Evil Pieces program. It was only meant to bring those back from the dead, if recent, or allow those to willingly reincarnate into a peerage. But doing it whilst they were having a nuclear meltdown sounded terrifyingly like a bad idea, but they had no other ideas. They couldn't pour ice water on the boy since his heat would just melt it into steam almost immediately. Let's try your idea, Rias, but if it fails, I blame you for this, Sona called out, covering her eyes from the burning sight of Izuku, screaming. Off to the side, a young woman with blonde hair watched Izuku in worry. Her gray-blue eyes kept their gaze on his emerald as he cried during the manifestation of a power he never thought he could have or manifest. Rias ran through the steam, her arms and clothes beginning to burn away into the heat that Izuku added to his very own powerful flames that burned brighter. By the time Rias was up close and personal to Izuku, she found a rather short boy with emerald eyes half-lidded and looking for any kind of release for all the rage and sorrow combining into one. Izuku, my name is Rias Gremory. Do you want the pain to stop? Rias asked, her tone grave as her clothes continued to burn. It hurts, too much. I'll do anything. Izuku cried out, his tears flying into the air before being transformed into steam. Then under the name of the Gremory family, I reincarnate you as my rook. Rias called out, a red rook fluttering to Izuku and phasing into his body. A gigantic magic circle appeared around Izuku's body and flew upwards. His body didn't really change in appearance, though his hair had evolved from being messy and unkempt to being just a messy, curly set of flames to represent his hair. The steam and heat immediately disappeared, leaving the area to suffer from a heat-powered explosion that sent Rias back into Issei, though for the young man, he caught her with her, squishing into his face. He mentally was so focused on Izuku being okay that he didn't even think about happily muttering about having his lifelong dream of motorboating granted to him. He placed Rias on the ground before staring at Izuku as the magic circle fell through the ground once more. Small red motes of light fluttering about the place before Izuku collapsed to the ground, his flaming hair continuing to sparkle in the cold air. His breathing was soft, but they couldn't help but call for an ambulance, so that they could see what in the world caused Izuku to manifest his quirk in such a strange and powerful fashion. You have a lot of explaining to do, Issei. Rias growled, grabbing the young man's collar. I'll explain it later, when Izuku's all right. Issei replied as Rias nodded. We'll have our meeting back at the ORC later. For now, we need to make sure he's all right. Rias said, using magic to replace her uniform. The blonde-haired woman from earlier walked over and helped Izuku into her arms. She was actually surprised by how light he was, despite the rook piece increasing his defense and strength. A smile hid her face as she helped him into her arms and carried him towards the gate, with Sona taking the barrier down and telling everyone to get back to normal. Occult Research Club Room, main room, early evening, 2265. I spent 10 years praying for a spark, never realizing I was a bonfire waiting for a match. I finally have the power I dreamed of, but as I look at the mark burned into my soul, I realize I've become something the world of heroes doesn't even have a name for. In all her time as a servant of her current king, Kiba Yumi was not one to be surprised too often. Though, when she had carried the newly appointed rook of Rias Gremory's peerage, she had noticed something quite strange about the new recruit. Midoriya Izuku, as Hayudu had been calling the sleeping boy, was very light in terms of weight, as though the young man was barely eating anything. Yumi had stared at Issei for a long while, his wild posturing as he explained how in the world he came across such a young man who was powerful in terms of the quirk world. It was quite funny, though if she were one to talk, she would find it quite strange that Izuku was very light. She had questioned Issei when the young man was done being drilled by Rias for any and all information on the young man herself. And Issei had stated that he'd found Midoriya when he was about to kill himself in a moment of pure, unadulterated sorrow and despair. It was hard for her to see how such a powerful young man was willing to go that far in order to end the pain in his heart, though now that she thought about it after Hayudu informed her that he was a very late bloomer, she could see the reason why. People and children can be quite cruel to those who are not born with a power of their own. She had her own quirk as well, seeing as how she had perfect balance on any form of platforms or ground she planted her feet on. But to be born with a quirk, have it be kept from you for what amounted to over a decade, is bound to be quite the rude awakening to someone who has always thought that they were powerless. Sighing to herself, Yumi had moved her fingers through the curly hair that had seemingly became sharper after the manifestation of the boy's quirk. The flames that had once been in place of his hair was no longer present, leaving rather sharp-looking curls. She had the boy's head on her lap as she softly carted her fingers through his hair, scraping at his scalp in order to pull each of the messy curls out of their original positions. The smile on her face showed that she wanted nothing but the best for the young man, though Issei looked to be very jealous of Midoriya, as he jealously cried in a corner. "I'm only providing a pillow for the boy to sleep on. He has essentially placed himself in a quirk-induced coma," Kiba said, as Issei nodded his head. "I know, but I've always dreamed of getting the infamous lap pillow. Now my little brother is getting it for himself. I'm so proud and jealous at the same time." Issei happily cried, but that happy expression turned serious. He's going to be very confused and angry that his power didn't come in until now. Issei said, his voice serious. "I can see that," Kiba said, looking at Izuku's peaceful expression. "We need to make sure he knows how to control his quirk before he can even come back into school." Issei stated, his tone grave, but worried. "Weren't you supposed to meet with Sona in order to tell her what was happening?" Kiba asked, as Issei blinked before rushing off. Now all alone with Izuku again, Kiba gave a small huff of air before she watched Izuku again. The soft expression on her face transformed into one of serious indifference before she glanced over at Rias, who was currently looking over all his files. Her expression was bordered on rage as she stared at the previous school records that have finally come in, Kaniko's investigation into the Aldra Junior High District finally bearing its fruit. "Something big, I presume?" Kiba asked, her tone soft. "Big is an understatement. All these records, they're so up, it's as though the teachers wanted to screw him over in getting into a high school he wants." Rias growled, her eye twitching. "You've never been this angry for someone before, Rias-san. Whatever is the problem?" Akino asked, giggling softly. "Take a look for yourself, Akino, and you'll see what I'm so furious about," Rias said, turning her laptop to Akino. The buxom woman had looked at the laptop, putting on a pair of glasses to actually read it. Her eyes went from the peaceful teasing expression to a slowly frowning expression that was closing in on fury and anger. Her eyes then glanced back at Rias, who was literally having an eyebrow twitch in fury as she kicked her legs around under her desk before Akino spoke up again. Have you asked Kaneko to look into the records of his schools before Aldera? Not to sound disrespectful or rude, but I'd like to see all the records before making my own opinion. Akino said, neutral in her stance. Yes, I have, but all those records were deleted. As though they were trying to hide actual information about the boy we are in charge of keeping happy from here on out. Ria said, biting her lip. That sounds more like hiding evidence of their wrongdoings than deleting information on a student. Akino said, before Kaneko called Rias. Kaneko? What's wrong? Rias asked, standing up from her seat. It appears that someone is very angry about Midoriya's disappearance from Yuzutafu, a young boy with ash-blonde hair and red eyes. He looks like a Pomeranian dog to me. Kaneko's voice rang through the magical call. Just ignore him, Kaneko. Your mission is complete. Return back here at once. We're going to need to make sure that Midoriya stays happy after waking up. Ria said with a sigh. At that moment, Issei entered the room with his mother. The elderly woman rushing into the room and finding Izuku sleeping on Kiba's lap before she pressed a hand to his forehead and realizing that he was now much colder than he was earlier in the day. Miki Hayadu looked to Issei and glared him in the eye before speaking. I see. What reason did you have to bring me to your school to find Izuku unconscious? Miki asked. His quirk manifested. It's a very powerful flame quirk, but we're still not sure what it's supposed to do. We were hoping you could give us some information on it. Issei said as Miki sighed. I see. Just because my quirk is an analysis quirk doesn't mean that I will be able to know what his capabilities are. Miki said, folding her arms under her bust. Just, please try. Issei asked, as Miki sighed again. All right, but I can't promise anything. Miki stated, before placing a palm over Izuku's chest. Kiba would watch on in fascination as Miki's hand glowed a bright amber color. The woman's eyes glowing a blue color in contrast before Issei handed the woman a notebook as she pulled a pen from her pocket and began to write down all that she could analyze from just reading his mind. By the time she was done writing everything she could on his quirk, she leaned back from the sleeping boy and sat on the couch near Issei. Kiba stared at the notebook and found that there was very little information that was gathered from his quirk based on Miki's quirk's usage. All right, what are we supposed to do with this? Kiba asked, as Issei pulled it from her hand and summarized it. My mom's quirk allows her to be extremely difficult in her terms when writing her analysis. So my dad, or I need to summarize the best parts and put in a language for everyone present or not present to understand. Issei said, before handing over the summarized portion to Kiba. The young woman blinked at the summarized portion of the analysis. This was a lot of information. So his quirk is the ability to heat from any form it takes? He can also create his own flames, though it's from his natural body heat. He can consume heat and control it telekinetically. But at the same time, if he takes too much heat, he undergoes a thermal meltdown. Kiba asked as Issei nodded. This may be very limited in terms of knowledge, but you should see his notebooks. I'm sure he'd be able to find a way to use his quirk without having to be too confused about its components. Issei said, handing a burned notebook to Kiba. Why is this burned? She asked, confused. His bully most probably burned it. Issei said with a shrug. For the rest of the afternoon, Issei and the rest of Ria's peerage would go about their day as per normal. Miki would leave after giving Izuku's sleeping form a hug and heading back home in order to set up dinner for them all. It wouldn't be until later on in the evening that Izuku would wake up from his quirk overuse with bleary eyes and very lethargic movements as he shook his head like a dog. The moment he woke up, however, his hair had transformed from being sharp curls back into a flaming set of hair as he glanced around the room, as though he were a cat waking from his nap. Blinking his eyes blearily, Izuku took in the room as Rias, Akino, Kiba, and Issei were staring at him in concern. Izuku stared between the group and Issei as he thought about what to say. He felt as though he had the best nap of his life. So much so that he didn't even remember what had happened to him all day. What happened? And why are you all staring at me like that? Izuku asked, tilting his head in confusion. Izuku, I'm not sure how to say this, but you know how you were quirkless? Issei asked, as Izuku frowned at that. You say that as though I have a quirk. I was told I was quirkless by my doctor. Izuku said, frowning. Yell, they kinda lied? Just an hour ago, you manifested a quirk, and before you go into a freak-out about how that happened, just read the information my mom made for you. Issei said, shoving a small notebook in his face. I'm not sure why you're acting like this, but okay. Izuku said, a little nervous before reading the summary and the original. His eyes went from confused and wide to nervous and wide as his hands began to tremble. It wasn't with fear or anger from what Issei could tell, however. The young man was looking as though he was vibrating in his seat. Izuku's emotions were so restrained that Issei's quirk found it extremely difficult to even see what kind of emotion the boy was even feeling in the moment. I have a Q quirk, Izuku asked, his voice soft like a whisper. Yeah, little brother, Issei said, kneeling before him. You have a quirk, one that is extremely powerful. Why did it take so long to manifest? Izuku asked as Issei sighed. Your body wasn't built to handle its heat. You are undergoing a thermal meltdown similar to that of a nuclear power plant. Issei explained as Izuku nodded. Okay, that makes a lot more sense. I was producing so much heat that my body couldn't withstand it anymore and tried to vent it all out in one sitting. Izuku said, beginning to mutter, as small written words of what he was saying began to filter out of his mouth and flutter into the room. Issei and the others immediately moved out of the way as Izuku randomly manifested a notebook that said Hero Analysis for My Future Volume 14 written on it. And within seconds he began to make theories and ideas for how he could utilize a quirk like this without having much time to learn how to use it physically. He had even made comments within the theories that he'd felt warmer during certain portions of the day when he felt happier or more elated. Whilst Izuku was muttering to himself, Issei looked to Rias. This is why reincarnating him is a good idea. Early morning, 2 days later. In the next couple of days that passed by, Izuku had been getting assistance from a quirk counselor, a young man who had seen many forms of quirks, and he primarily worked on fire quirks since they were particularly difficult to handle. But when seeing Izuku's quirk, he found out that if Izuku kept his emotions leveled out, then he wouldn't need to worry about another explosion of flames that ate all the heat in an area away. And the same was for having very sorrowful emotions. The opposite would occur, where he would change the cold in an area and amplify it far more than it would. Though Izuku was already looking into this, he had been training himself to use his quirk for the last couple of days. The counselor had informed the Hayudu family that Izuku will need to constantly use his quirk in order to get an understanding for how much heat he should take in as well as produce. Considering the fact that his body is now similar to a nuclear power plant, he should be far more capable of keeping his heat and cold subsets of powers in check. It is without considering, however, that the young man needs to constantly be checked up on in terms of temperature since nobody has manifested a fire snow quirk so late in their lives. The counselor had also stated that because of the late manifestation, Izuku might get traits of another subset of quirks from the mutation style. Unlike most fire quirk users who enter a strange opposing cold or heat, because of their quirk specialty, Izuku would have a mixture of both. So that means he'd enter a state of frost during the summer, whilst in the winter, he'd enter a state of heat that will make him both irritable towards outside events and stimuli. It was wisely stated that he has a specific room to help him during those times. He got away with it this year because of what was going on with his manifestation, but the next year may not be so kind. So Izuku found himself in the backyard of the Hayata house. He was sitting in a meditative state, his legs crossed over one another with his hands connected to one another in a small, triangle form in his lap. He had long since gotten used to how his hair was literally on fire. There wasn't any stopping that anymore, but it was a heat that would allow hands to enter his hair as though it weren't even on fire. In terms of how hot it was basically room temperature, though whenever he was flustered or embarrassed, it would increase its intensity and heat. Because of how sudden his manifestation of his quirk was, Izuku started to look at his quirk as though it were a nuclear reactor. If the heat got too much, he would need to administer a cooling agent in order to keep the heat down and level. Through some extra training with Akino, he was able to introduce the learning of water magic in order to help him keep a leveled-out reactor core for his body, meaning he just needed to drink at least 20 to 30 ounces of freezing water every hour in order to keep his natural heat leveled out and not overloaded. As of this moment, however, Izuku could be seen drinking some freezing water. Issei was next to him after the young man had finished his own morning training with Rias, his mind flickering back to the young girl who he had met earlier that week. Issei was thinking about saving her. He knew where she was, being at the old church on the hill. He just didn't know whether or not he should bring Izuku with him in order to assist. The young man was still learning how to both use his newfound power as well as be a rook for Rias Gremory. "Hey, Izuku, can I ask you a question?" Issei asked, his back to his little brother. "Sure thing. What do you need to know?" Izuku questioned, his expression inquisitive. If there was someone who needed help, but she didn't ask for it, would you help them? Issei asked, as Izuku thought about it for a moment. "Do they really need help?" Izuku asked, looking at Issei. "They don't say they need help, but they're so kind, so much so that it feels as though you're leaving a part of yourself behind." Issei clarified. "Then I wouldn't even need to think about it. I'd help them without even thinking about the consequences. If they need help, the right thing to do is to save them, even if they don't wish for it." Izuku said as Issei sighed. He didn't want to bring Izuku in on this, but the boy's heart was getting his own riled up. "All right, I need your brain for something. Something big," Issei said, as Izuku tilted his head. "Who do you need help saving?" Izuku asked, his eyes expressively confused. "I need your brain in order to plan a way to get a girl out of the hands of someone who caused my death," Issei said, his tone serious. Issei wouldn't ever state this to anyone else, considering Izuku was alone with him. But Izuku looked as though he were a villain when the smile on his face became very apparent, his emerald iris glowing as though he were standing in the shade. And the sun was right in the middle of the sky. Kuo Town, early evening, 2265. They told me that a hero's heart is what matters, but hearts are fragile things. They break under pressure. They burn out. But a reactor? A reactor doesn't care about your feelings. It only cares about the output. If the world wants to treat me like a monster, I might as well show them that I'm the most efficient monster they've ever seen. Izuku and Issei stood in the park of Kuo Town, the young men thinking about how to save the young woman named Argento Asia. Izuku sat on the bench, his hair flickering around with the power of his quirk active as palm under his chin as he muttered about possible plans. Issei was pacing around the park as he tried to figure out what to do in order to save Asia from the clutches of the very fallen angel that had killed him just a week prior. The young man was trying to figure out how to ask Rias for permission to raid the church to save Asia, since the young woman clearly didn't want to be around the fallen angels and priests. Izuku, however, was thinking more along the lines of the present. "Hey, Issei, I think I have a plan," Izuku said, his expression neutral. "What's your plan, little brother?" Issei asked. "Why don't we attack the church in the middle of the day? We call in sick and attack the place before they even have a chance to do anything bad to Asia." Izuku asked as he stared at Issei. "That won't give me any time in order to inform Rias about my plans," Issei said as Izuku smiled. "The heart of a hero is helping when it's not asked for, and meddling where you're not meant to is the essence of a hero." Izuku replied as Issei thought about it. "I still want to let Bucho know about where we're going," Issei said as Izuku nodded. "It'd probably be for the best since I'd be distracting most of the people there," Izuku said as Issei thought about it. "Wait, you be distracting them? How?" Issei asked as Izuku smiled. "I just manifested my quirk just a couple days ago, and I think I have a way to lure all the fallen angels and priests out. I'm going to force my body to go into a thermal meltdown within the church, forcing them to take everyone out. You can use the time that they're running out in order to grab Asia and escape," Izuku said as Issei shook his head. "That'd have me leaving you behind to deal with the brunt of their numbers," Issei retorted as Izuku shook his head. "I know how to run away from threats, Issei. I've been doing it my entire life, and I'm pretty sure that they won't realize that I'm using a quirk to increase my own speed. Izuku said as Issei paused. You have a plan for how you can increase your speed from how it is normally? Issei asked. Yup. You see, when heat rises, the cold falls. And there is a specific hero out there who uses his quirk to pseudo-fly in the sky. Though he is the reason I'm an orphan, I will need to borrow his skill. Izuku said, using the very same ability. You are aware that as a devil you can fly with the wings given by the evil piece, right? Issei asked, causing Izuku to blink in confusion. Really? Where are the wings? Izuku asked, looking at his back in anticipation. Issei moved behind Izuku's back and slapped it with enough force to cause his devil wings to sprout out. Unlike the normal wings, however, Izuku's wings had a small bit of emerald flames fluttering off them. Izuku was in awe at the wings before staring at Issei as the young man smiled. This was the smile of a plan coming to fruition. Okay, well, I might still need to learn how to fly with these wings. I'm pretty sure that I can get the gist of how to fly with them whilst running from the priests and fallen angels. Izuku muttered before Issei moved away from Izuku to call Rias. Journey to the church on the hill, Kuo Town. While Issei called Rias on his phone, in the background Izuku could be seen floating in the air somewhat. He was currently trying to get the hang of flying without having to deal with it in the moment as he makes to escape the church after Issei saves Asia. The young man kept jerking in different directions before he forced himself to stay on the path heading towards the church. All the while his quirk was slowly increasing in its temperature so that when they arrive at the church, he can instantly activate the thermal meltdown to essentially send those inside towards the only exit. Issei spoke to Rias about how he couldn't just leave Asia in the hands of the fallen angels. How he was bringing Izuku along with him so that he has some form of backup to defeat the fallen angels should they manage to get past the young man. While Rias was very pissed off that Issei was doing this in broad daylight, she couldn't help but praise the idea coming from Izuku, stating to Issei on the call that it was actually pretty smart. Especially since they would be thinking that the devils would come at night when they are more powerful. Having them come during the day, when they are slightly weaker in the sunlight, would make the fallen angels underestimate them. Especially Izuku, since he's still undergoing the throes of his manifested quirk. And since it's only been a couple of days, he has more than enough heat collected to act as a beacon. When Izuku and Issei arrived at the bottom of the stairs leading to the church, the two conjured up a barrier surrounding the church so that those in the city don't notice a battle happening. And while Issei was thinking about saving Asia, just as he had saved Izuku, just 4 days prior Izuku was thinking about something else. As much as he loved to assist Issei with this mission, Izuku couldn't help but feel all the anger and hatred he felt at the people who had effectively abandoned him. He was brought into a different version of a world because he wasn't fit for his old one. But he felt more accepted within the world of the supernatural than he had being outside of it. A small glow in his emerald eyes rose from behind his iris as he couldn't help but mentally laugh at the idea. He was effectively going to cook all the fallen angels, priests, and nuns within the place and keep it nice and cool around Asia. Issei wanted to keep her safe from any and all damage surrounding the girl. So Izuku was planning on pushing his body to the limit in order to keep that girl safe and help Issei reclaim his status as the young woman's hero. It was the least he could do for the young man who helped save his life when he was at his lowest, though he couldn't help the rise of anticipation for when he would kick the doors of the church down in order to cause them to rush out in fear. Izuku licked his lips as he thought of seeing the fear on their faces. Thinking about how their faces would look when seeing how he is no longer the quirkless freak Deku anymore, and he will show them the true power he holds. It wouldn't take much longer than a minute before the two arrived at the front door of the church. Izuku glanced over at Issei as the young man hid within a bush before Izuku moved towards the front door of the church. Remember the plan, Izuku. You burn up the place and keep Asia cool so she can escape. Once she's outside of the building, then you can go thermonuclear. Issei said as Izuku smiled at him. Of course. I will show all of them their place. Izuku growled, his eyes gaining a red tint. Izuku walked up to the door of the church, staring at his hand for a moment. A small flickering emerald flame licking at his fist as he clenched it tightly, drawing a tiny amount of BLD before he called out to those within the church. He could sense their presences within, and the smile on his face became sadistic. "Hey, assholes!" Izuku called out, punching a hole into the doors. Inside the church, a voice shrieked in fear as Izuku poked his face through the hole he'd punched. "Here's Johnny!" Izuku cackled before breaking through the door with his entire body. Issei watched as Izuku broke down the doors of the church as a huge amount of steam was thrusted out of the building. He stayed out in the bush even as the area in front of himself began to show a mirage of heat fluttering around the area. For a few minutes, nothing seemed to happen. That was until people began coughing and rushing out the open door as they all began to scream in fear as one of them rushed out. Her long blonde hair flowing with the heat as she looked greatly confused about what was going on before Issei grabbed her and hid in the bush. The young woman was about to scream, but Issei spoke in a low tone. "Don't worry, Asia, I've got you," Issei said as Asia stared at him in shock. "It's you," she mumbled, through his hand covering her mouth. "Yeah, and I wasn't alone," Issei replied before telepathically calling to Izuku. "All right, little brother, let him have it." Asia watched as the church was suddenly increasing in heat as Issei grabbed her in a princess carry. She watched as the church that she had been forced to stay within suddenly exploded with a massive amount of heat slamming into the barrier above the place. A pillar of emerald flames hitting everything within a 20-meter radius and just licking at their backs before a figure could be seen flying towards them with fury on their expression. Asia was fearful as she leapt out of Issei's arms before the young man felt the danger behind himself, dodging the light spear that slammed into the ground behind him. Issei found himself staring at Rainier. The woman burned and scorched as though she'd been put through a pizza oven, though he had to say the burned clothing was doing a lot of things to him. "You little, how dare you attack in the day? Are you crazy?" Rainier growled angrily. "Yeah, you're not getting Asia," Issei yelled, summoning his sacred gear. "You really think that twice critical can hurt me? That's weak as SHD," Rainier growled, before the sounds of screaming could be heard from the church. Asia, Rainier, and Issei glanced up at the church to see what the screaming was about. And looking at the top of the stairs, 3 fallen angels could be seen crawling away from the church as though a monster was coming from it. They were horrifically burned, half of their faces having seemingly been melted, their skulls showing muscle and tendons keeping itself together. One of them, a very buxom woman, had been hurt the least as she struggled to walk away before a voice was heard behind them, all causing them to turn towards the church. Walking out of the church, as though he were the literal devil, was Izuku. His expression was bordering on complete insanity as he stared at his arms and wings as they were held out wide. "You know, I never thought I'd see the day that Kakin would be so fearful of me. But seeing how scared you all are is so intoxicating. I wonder, can you feel fear?" Izuku asked, his manic eyes flaring wide as his body became the embodiment of fire. Stairs to the church, later afternoon. Asia Argento knew that many things in her life was very different. She had made a good friend in Hayudo Issei, but ever since she had been captured, she noticed how they were erecting a massive cross in the basement. So when she noticed the heat increasing around her, but the exact position within the church she stood was cool, made her think that something odd was happening. That was when she heard the manic screams of a boy who was attacking the place, as though he knew what was going on. She watched him fight all the priests before burning them to ash. The manic expression on his face put her in fear because she thought that she'd be next. But when his eyes landed on her, he had somehow managed to use the strange, cool air to place her near the exit as though he came for her. She didn't think twice in that moment before finding a way out of the building in order to save herself. But she couldn't help but worry about the boy inside as he looked about a year younger than her. But the fear she held about the boy won out before she was grabbed and hidden in a bush, and the minutes that passed from finding Hayudo again, she was very happy about that. To now, she was downright terrified of what the young man who saved her was becoming. He had literally transformed into the embodiment of fire, and attacked the fallen angels at the top of the steps. Even Rainier was terrified as she, Issei, and Asia watched in morbid fascination as Izuku burned the fallen angel trio to nothing more than black feathers. The trio watched as the fallen angels were slowly cooked alive, the lights in their eyes disappearing in a massive wall of green flames. Looking to Issei, Asia tried to figure out if Issei knew that this was all right. But he didn't even look all right. He looked confused and terrified at the same time. This wasn't how it was supposed to go then. Rainier then called out to the two. I don't know about you two, but I'm not sure if he's entirely still there. Rainier growled, entering a combat stance in front of the two. You think I will team up with you in order to fight my brother? Issei called out, confusing Rainier. I read your file, dipshit. You don't have a brother. Rainier retorted with a loud scream. It was recent. Issei replied angrily. None of them were prepared for Izuku to suddenly appear before Rainier. The flames licking off his body were much less than before now, and the young man was slowly lifting his head to stare up at Rainier. Issei was even surprised by the sheer speed Izuku had used to get this close to them both without even being seen. Izuku then grabbed Rainier by the neck before pulling the woman down to his height. Another meal for the flame god. Izuku growled, his eyes wide and iris pinpricks. Within moments of grabbing Rainier, Izuku flew off to the sky as though he knew how to fly like a pro. Rainier was more powerful than the other three fallen angels, so as she was being pummeled into the dirt at the top of the steps, she was blocking each hit, though the woman was taking more and more damage, and even she knew that she needed to attack back. So as she created multiple light blades, she swung them towards Izuku in a bid to defend herself, only for fire blades to manifest in the air to block her attacks. What? Rainier called out in confusion. A powerful right hook slammed into her cheek, knocking her to the ground before Izuku landed on top of her. His palm was planted directly on her chest as his face became outright demonic as he lowered his face to hers, her face slowly becoming burnt from the proximity. Issei and Asia reached the top of the stairs to find Izuku raising a fist into the air and slamming his fist into Rainier's face, causing the ground to crater with spiderweb cracks. Izuku continued to do this until Rainier was nothing more than black feathers fluttering through the air, the pounding of his fist in the ground, sounding like music to Izuku's ears. Izuku! Issei yelled as Izuku stood still. For a moment, Izuku turned to look at Issei, his face obscured by the fire crossing over his face. Issei was worried that Izuku was becoming a straight devil in a moment. That was until Izuku's face was revealed once more as his body trembled from the high usage of his quirk. His expression was now no longer covered in sadistic glee, and it was replaced with guilty remorse for what he had done in the moment, falling to his knees as tears fell from his eyes. His hands were pulled in front of him as he stared down at them, with something akin to regret and fear. What have I done? Izuku asked, fear lacing his tone. Izuku, you're all right. Why were you acting like that? Issei called out, hugging Izuku tight. I don't know what came over me. It felt so good to be the predator for once. Izuku said, tears falling from his eyes. But you came back. How did that happen? Issei asked, looking into Izuku's eyes. I don't know. Ever since my quirk came in, it felt so intoxicating, I wanted more. I don't know if I can continue liking my quirk right now. Izuku said, trembling. What matters right now is that you're safe and you're not losing your mind. Thought you were going stray for a moment. Issei said, as Izuku sniffled to himself. It felt as though I was dissociating with the world. Izuku thought to himself. Steps to the church, late evening. There were many things Rias Gremory had wanted to see in her life. A dragon who wasn't close to her family, the rising through the rankings of her latest pawn, and most importantly the church where she was supposed to be at earlier. When she arrived at the church, she was expecting Issei and Izuku to be completely overwhelmed and in desperate need of help. She had expected that Izuku, being extremely new to being a devil, to be struggling with his strength. She did not prepare to arrive at a church that looked as though a nuclear bomb had landed on it. Not too far away from it, though, Issei was seen giving Izuku multiple bottles of ice water as the young man tore through them, with a fervor she'd never seen since 2 days ago. But looking at the surrounding area, she could finally see the amount of damage Izuku could do with his quirk if he went full power. Her eyes were wide, just as Akino, Kiba, and Kaneko arrived at the top of the steps next to her to summarize the amount of damage done here. Kaneko was the one who came up with a surprising insult towards Issei. "So, did you do this with your massive load?" Kaneko questioned. "This was all my little brother. Izuku did all this, though he did kind of fall under the intoxication of his power." Issei retorted with a chuckle. "Wow, didn't think he had it in him to defile a church." Kaneko replied as she walked close to Izuku. "Is that a bad thing?" Izuku asked, panting heavily. "Not exactly, but I'm not a fan of fallen angels who enter territory without asking," Kaneko said, patting his head. Rias could only stare in awe at the level of destruction on display. Craters were all around the place. Even inside the broken-down church, there was a lot of craters. But if there was one thing she noticed, it was the distinct lack of feathers within the area to show that fallen angels were in the area. Asia, however, was standing near Issei as the young man tended to his little brother, the fear the young woman had shown to Izuku having been replaced with concern. How hot was he in the moment he reached the apex of his strength? Asia asked, as Issei proudly replied to her. Last I checked, the highest he could reach in temperature was around, 900 degrees Celsius. Issei asked, looking to Izuku. About 2,500 actually. Izuku stuttered out, drinking another bottle of water. Rias glanced back at the surrounding area before finding a stray black feather. It was horrifically burned, and using her own magic to see what happened here, she saw everything from the viewpoint of the fallen it belonged to. Izuku being a monster in appearance, becoming one with fire and melting everything around him until he fought Rainier and killed her through sheer heat alone. Now that wouldn't have caused her to be concerned. No, as it showed she made the right choice in turning him into a devil. But what really caught her attention was the fact that he'd nearly lost himself in the power of his quirk. Izuku, from now on, Akino and Kiba will teach you how to MSTR your quirk without letting its power get to your head. You need to be level-headed when you're using it. Rias said, her tone serious. Why, yes, ma'am, Izuku said, saluting the young woman. I expect great things of you as my final rook, Rias said, patting his head affectionately. I'll try not to let you down, Izuku said, panting before drinking some more water. Off to the side, Kiba pulled Izuku aside, the young man blinking at her in confusion. She stared at him with nothing more than concern before pulling him into a hug. Izuku felt his face blush when feeling his head be pulled into her ample chest. His arms froze in the air since he'd never been hugged like this aside from Issei and his parents. This was entirely new for a girl he doesn't really even know doing this to him. Kiba watched his eyes staring up at her through her chest as she smiled. His face was still flushed from the output of power he'd done only an hour earlier. Now, the first thing we need to do is give you your homework that you missed, Kiba said, a small smile on her face. Thank you. I'm sorry for causing you so much trouble for that, Izuku said, his eyes becoming swirls of embarrassment. It's fine. At least I can keep an eye on you much longer than before, Kiba replied. Old school building, courtyard, Kuo Town, 2265. A disaster is just power without a purpose. They call me a rook, a piece meant to stand its ground and weather the storm, but I'm beginning to realize that the hardest part isn't surviving the heat. It's making sure I don't become the very wildfire I'm trying to contain. In this world, a blunt instrument is a liability. A sharpened one is a legend. Izuku fell back onto the ground as he struggled to gather air into his lungs. He'd been training under Kiba for the last few hours since waking up this morning, and the young man wasn't sure how he was being dealt so much damage in such a short amount of time. Sure, he was a rook, but that didn't exactly translate into fighting experience for him since he'd never been pushed as far as he currently is against Kiba. The times before he became a devil, as well as him fighting the priests and fallen angels don't count since he had the drop on them and was able to damage them severely before they reached him. So here he was, laying in the dirt on his back, sweat falling down his back as he tried to get back up. An arm with a palm connected to it reached out to him, and Izuku took the extended limb and was assisted up from the ground as he panted heavily. The morning sun was rising high into the air as the early morning mist was moving about the two as though it were snow. Izuku's emerald eyes stared at Kiba as she stood wearing a white tank top with dark blue shorts that reached her knees. As much as he'd rather not pay much attention to that kind of detail, his eyes couldn't stop wandering. Curse Issei and his apparent love of a woman's bust. Izuku thought to himself as he wiped dust and dirt off him. Are you all right, Midoriya? You seem to be turning very red. Kiba asked, leaning forward a bit. Why, yes. I am fine, just a little winded. Izuku replied, face blushing up a storm. All right. Do you understand the meaning of this exercise, then? Kiba asked curiously. The whole meaning of this training is to help me not fall into the intoxication of my power again, to control it with the level of precision and experience similar to that of a pro hero. Izuku stated before asking in worry. Close, but not quite. Seeing as how Ryusen needed to use a rook in order to help you MSTR your quirk's drawback, we are training you in order to MSTR your quirk first. Though, I wouldn't be averse to having you train your newly found strength and defense, Kiba said, placing a couple fingers under her chin in thought at the last part. Much as I would love that too, I'd rather learn everything I seek in about my quirk. I was thinking of calling it anatomy. Izuku said, looking to Kiba. Anatomy? She asked, curiously tilting her head in confusion. Isn't the meaning of that word not exactly the same as using atom? Not exactly. I want the name to cause those around me to blink in confusion when it's stated. They'll think it's nothing related to the flames I can produce at will. Izuku said, as Kiba blinked in surprise. You plan on naming your quirk something else to take away any potential thoughts that it could do something with flames. A good idea, but if enough people notice it, they will figure out it's a ploy. Kiba said as Izuku smiled. Who said I was going to reveal my quirk to everyone by calling it out? For all they know, those we come across, that is, might just think it's flame magic. Izuku said, shrugging. Kiba shook her head in amusement. As much as she thought that he was correct per se, he was still a little wrong. There were those out there who could sniff out that the flames he was using was almost entirely a quirk. Ever since quirks came about, it was nearly impossible for those of the three factions to ignore them and not take them into their ranks. Rias was one such being who just couldn't help herself when it came to bringing in those who were powerful, but at the same time, very technique worthy. Izuku was one of those powerful pieces but lacked DSBLN, not because of how he grew up, but because he was without a power for so long. It was no wonder he got intoxicated on the power when he was first able to use it for rescue. Even if it was a bit skewed in terms of how he went way too far against the fallen angels at the church, she still understood that the reason he went that far was because he wanted to help. All right. As of right now, though, you need to get back into the middle of the ring. I won't let you stop using your flames until you figure out a way to keep yourself from overheating when using the flames. Kiba said, lightly smacking his back with a Bakken sword. Izuku let out a yelp before moving back into the circle and focused on his quirk. The flames that Kiba had seen the other day was emerald green in color, and the flames Izuku was currently using were orangish red. It seems as though the emerald green flames were the highest form of heat he could produce, but at the same time, it nearly takes all his energy in order to even reach that level of heat. So they had a large cooler filled with iced water and juice, so they could figure out which forms of cold drinks could make him get back to full strength/stamina faster. So far, ice water was the fastest drink that could get him to full stamina. And at the same time, the drink that came in a very close second was actually Glacier Freeze Gatorade. For hours, Kiba would have Izuku undergo the same level of training until his body was layered with sweat. But it wouldn't be until the later portion of the day that Izuku would figure out a new way to use his flame quirk. As during his training, his flames accidentally took on a teal-green color, except they weren't even that cold. If anything, it was lukewarm in heat. This greatly surprised Kiba as she felt the heat in the area increase as the flame got colder over time, all the way until the flames were so cold that they were giving her skin a light sheen of ice. Kiba blinked at that, before looking to Izuku to see what he thought, only to find the young man completely encompassed in ice, his eyes blinking in confusion as his body couldn't move. Though his teeth were chattering as though he were struggling to get enough heat into his body, he was mumbling under his breath about the ways he could use this form of fire. It wasn't a very hot fire. If anything, the fire was actually extremely cold, something that Izuku decided to call flash freeze. When spreading the cold fire across his body, the ice melded with his body, creating a form of icicle armor that was actually pretty heavy. Kiba brought over a large piece of wood, just to see the level of power he could wield with both Rook's strength and this new form of ice. When Izuku pulled his arm back, though his body trembled from the cold, he pulled as much of his strength into the punch. As his arm thrusted forward towards the wood, the sound of wood splintering and snapping under a pressure that wasn't able to be seen or felt was heard. Kiba stared at the wood as it was snapped in two, the portions of it near the middle where Izuku's fist slammed into it, frosting at the torn and shredded pieces. "Well, it's like we found out a way for you to use this cold to your advantage," Kiba said, a smile gracing her lips. "Why, yeah, I can use this in order to balance out my overheating. Just gotta go the opposite direction of where I usually want to when it comes to my fire." Izuku summarized. "Want to continue learning this?" Kiba asked, as Izuku shook his head. "Bucho-sama said that I have a client to see if I can complete today. Though I'm not sure who it will be, I just hope that they don't live in Mizudafu," Izuku said, shuddering. "I would hope so as well," Kiba said, her tone uncharacteristically stony. The two walked towards the old school building, Izuku sweating from both the cold and heat, and Kiba thinking to herself. Neither said a word as Izuku was slowly gaining his stamina and magical energy back from the usage of both his quirk and devil powers. The silence of the early morning catching them in awe as the sun continued to rise high into the air, as though it were presenting the fact that it would be a relatively good day for them. While the two of them were walking, however, Izuku had the feeling that he was being watched and glanced over his shoulder to find a brown hawk-like creature watching him. Blinking in confusion, he watched as its beady black eyes stared at him, until he realized it was staring at Kiba, or rather, her generously sized rear, causing him to flare up in what he could only feel as jealousy before raising a finger towards the bird. As much as he didn't like hurting any form of life, that bird just felt wrong to him, so he pushed out a tiny beam of pure flame towards it. It was something he hid from Kiba since she was still focused on the area ahead of them. And as the small beam of fire slammed into the bird, it disappeared in a small circle of yellow flames. Yellow flames? Something isn't right here, Izuku thought to himself as both him and Kiba arrived at the old school building's entrance. Clients getting a contract. After getting all the information about where he was supposed to go for his client, Issei was busy helping Asia get adjusted to her new life as a devil, and Izuku left the building with a small smile on his face. He'd successfully managed to show that he could save someone. Even if he'd made himself look more akin to a monster than an actual hero, it filled him with pride. He'd managed to achieve something that those of his past had always teased and bullied him about, how he'd never be capable of saving someone from death or a villain. Walking through the streets towards the place where he'd be meeting his client, Izuku found himself standing before a small house. It was relatively small in appearance, but as he knocked on the door, Izuku heard the sounds of people talking on the other side of the door. He wasn't aware of the fact that in order to be summoned, he needed to use a magical circle Rias had prepared for him to head out from. He just followed Issei's directions about what to do for a contract, based on the young man's experience of being a devil. The door opened to reveal two classmates from Kuo Academy who stared at him in confusion. They had the slip in their hands that had the Gremory symbol inside as he straightened himself and gave a bow. "Hello, I'm Midoriya Izuku, devil of the Gremory family." Izuku introduced himself to the two girls. "Midoriya-kun? You mean the very same Midoriya-kun who is new to Kuo Academy?" A voice called out causing Izuku to stand back upright. Yes. Did you know of me? Izuku asked, tilting his head in concern. Oh, you're the new student at our school. It's so nice to meet you, Midoriya-kun. My name is Keitase, and this is Murayama, Keitase said, introducing herself and her friend. Nice to meet you, Keitase-san and Murayama-san. As should we begin this summons? Izuku asked as the two girls allowed him inside. Walking into the small house, Izuku found himself staring at what amounted to a minimalist setup. The kitchen wasn't fully set up, and most of the other things that belonged to either girl were in the process of being set up within the place. Blinking in confusion at this, Izuku glanced at the two girls with an expression that was asking what was going on before Murayama spoke up. My dad and mom are heading out on vacation, so they decided to pay for a house that both myself and Keitase could live within. We just need help putting some of these things together as well as moving things around. Think you can help? Murayama explained before asking. Sure thing. I might not exactly be too strong, but I'm always happy to help, Izuku said, smiling. What followed was an extremely long hour of setting up the small house. The refrigerator was the hardest since the two girls required him to move it about the place in positions that didn't seem to fit where they thought it should go. Fortunately, Izuku had more than enough strength to move it until they found the perfect spot in their eyes to set everything up for themselves. After the kitchen and living room was set up, the girls moved up the stairs to their bedrooms in order to set those up for them to live within from that point onward. Walking up the stairs following the two women, Izuku found himself staring at both of their doors in hesitation. He knew that, as a devil, he was required to assist them with whatever they wanted for their contract to be created. He paused in front of either door as he struggled to think about how he should do anything in there. A bedroom in his eyes was the only place those two girls had the most privacy, and he didn't want to impose on it. So as he leaned against the wall outside of the rooms, he heard movement and yelling from inside before the door was slammed open with a head of brown hair glaring in all directions. Where is he? He supposed to be dash. Murayama yelled before noticing his very strained and concerned expression. Did I do something wrong? Izuku asked, concern on his expression. Yes, you did. Why didn't you enter the room? Keitase yelled, poking her head out as well. Isn't your bedroom supposed to be a place where you keep your privacy? I didn't want to intrude, Izuku said, rubbing his left arm. Both girls froze in place at that. They were so focused on how they were supposed to set up the bedrooms that they forgot about gender. Murayama slapped herself in the face for forgetting the fact that if Haidu were the one here, he wouldn't have waited for too long. But considering this is a young man who is very clearly not a pervert, at least in their eyes, he was just being honorable about their privacy. Sighing to themselves, the door was held wide open as both girls retorted to him. You can come into the bedrooms, Midoriya-kun. You're not interrupting anything, just that we need your help in setting up the place, Murayama said, as Izuku followed after her inside the room. Looking at the bedroom itself, Izuku could see multiple forms of posters of song groups. Not only that, but he could see some form of hero merchandise, something that he could actually connect with the girls with. As he stared at the merchandise, he felt a palm land on his shoulder, bringing his attention back to assisting them with setting up the room for the girls to use. After about another hour of moving things around and setting up the bedroom, as a whole, Izuku found himself in front of a few boxes. Blinking at the boxes in confusion, Izuku glanced at the two girls as they were amicably talking to one another as he focused on finishing some of their boxes. Opening the box in front of him, he cared little about what was written on the top before he opened the box itself. Inside were multiple pairs of pants, shirts, and a few sets of socks that Izuku thought nothing of and separated into the drawers of a nearby dresser. The longer he separated the clothing apart from one another, he was beginning to get into a groove. Once all the clothing and socks were separated, he finally reached the final box that held the word clothes on it. Thinking nothing of the box's name, he opened the box once more only to pause when he saw multiple cloths that resembled BRs that he most assuredly didn't want to look at in this very moment. Blushing up a storm, he closed the box with a slam that was accidentally too loud, causing the two girls who were talking amicably to one another to look at him. Did you find something? Murayama asked, as Izuku shoved the box towards her and turned away. I found the last bit of clothes for you, though I don't think I should look at them, Izuku replied, closing his eyes as he kept his gaze away from the girls. Oh, these are my bras and underwear. I was wondering where they were at. Thanks for finding them. Can you put them away? I need to make dinner, Murayama asked, as Izuku turned to her with betrayal on his face. I can't do that. That's just wrong, and Izuku replied in dismay. What? A little scared of the feminine form? Murayama asked with a giggle. Or are you scared of the consequences of looking at them? Keite's questioned with a raised eyebrow and a very strange tone of voice. I assent that something only you girls should do. I don't want to be a sea creep, Izuku mumbled as he looked away from them. It's not being a creep to put clothes away. We can always buy new clothes. But it's only creepy if you do anything with them. Keite replied with a shrug. So, I won't get in trouble for touching them and putting them away? Izuku asked, concern etched onto his face. You will not get beaten for touching our bras and underwear. It'd be like us touching your boxers, Murayama said, with a smile on her face. I don't wear boxers. They make me itch, Izuku mumbled. The two girls blinked at him when he said that, but ignored his trembling hands as he sorted through their bras and underwear. Within the next 15 minutes, the smell of dinner was coursing through the hall, and Izuku had finished setting up the dresser with the bras and underwear of both women. Coming down the stairs, he began to use his quirk to cool himself down from the hard work dealing with everything that was too heavy for the girls to handle. Upon entering the kitchen, however, he found both girls panting heavily as though they were overheating. Geez, who turned up the thermostat? I could have sworn it was room temperature in here. Keite grumbled. What? Izuku asked, poking his head into the room. Can you check the thermostat, Midoriya-kun? We think someone increased it whilst we weren't looking, Murayama asked, as Izuku did as he was told. Walking towards the thermostat, Izuku found that it was pretty normal aside from the heightened temperature. Though it was set specifically to be around 21 degrees Celsius, the number stated that it was actually 44 degrees Celsius. Looking around himself, he suddenly realized that he was taking the cold of the house away to cool himself off before letting himself drop the coolness he felt all over his body. Walking back into the kitchen, he found both women sweating a storm in their shirts, though they looked more akin to sweating goddesses in front of him. Sorry about that. But the thermostat is normal. Nobody changed the temperature, Izuku said as Keite blinked. Then if nobody changed the thermostat, who did? Murayama asked, confused. That was my power. Sorry, I was just trying to cool myself off, Izuku said, chuckling nervously. So that's why the temperature spiked so high in here. I thought for a second it was the oven releasing too much heat each time I opened it, Murayama said, with a happy smile on her face. So you can take the cold of a room and give it to yourself? How does that work? Keite curiously asked. It's not exactly like that. I can manipulate the atomic structure of fire and snow to the point that I can change the temperature in an area, Izuku explained as both girls blinked at him. Wow, that's actually pretty cool. So what kind of devil are you? The pitchfork and brimstone kind, or the very sultry and handsome kind? Murayama asked, curious as well. Oh, no. Ryusbucho says that devils aren't like that at all. Devils are basically like humans, just with the ability to use demonic magic, just a darker version of light magic, Izuku said as the girls nodded. All right, what kind of magical spells do you know? Keite questioned. I haven't gotten that far in my training. I've just been trying to MSTR my quirk, Izuku said as the girls blinked at him. You weren't using magic to change the temperature? Murayama asked. No, my quirk is called anatomy. Though it's meant to make others think of something else aside from atomic structures, I can manipulate the electrons, protons, and neutrons in an area to change the temperature. Though I personally think of it as though my body is a nuclear reactor, Izuku said, nervously chuckling. That's actually pretty cool. Our quirks just give us better stability or no help at all when we train with Kendo, Murayama said with a smile. That's still pretty cool. Though, I'm sure that both of you could use it many times in your future, Izuku said, giving a small smile of his own. With those questions answered, Izuku noticed that the sun was beginning to dip outside, and prepared to leave. As he stood up, he stretched his arms and legs, hearing good pops of his bones within the limbs before feeling a palm touch his back. Turning to look at who touched his back, he found that the girls were noticing his devil wings sprouted out from his back. He fluttered them as the two girls touched the wings in awe, though they shouldn't feel anything since he hasn't really learned how to use them properly. They were still sensitive. Izuku could feel his wings tremble at the attention, but as soon as he felt his face flush, he hid the wings. The girls pouted at this as Izuku spoke up. Can I have a way to show Ryusbucho that the contract goals were met? Izuku asked as the girls blinked. What kind of contract? The girls questioned. I won't be taking your souls, just something I can take back as a sign that the contract was finished. Izuku said as the girls thought about it. I can think of something to set yourself up with a contract. Kate said before rushing up the stairs. What is she doing? Izuku mumbled before Murayama giggled to herself. The two girls saw how Izuku reacted to their bras and underwear earlier, and they wanted to give him something to think about whilst he was leaving. As Kate returned back down, she had Izuku close his eyes and place the item in his palm. As his hands squeezed the material in confusion, he stared down at it as a red magical circle appeared beneath his feet. His eyes went wide with confusion and concern as he disappeared with a singular blue BR in his hands. Murayama and Kate's faces of pure elation and hilarious roaring laughter being the last thing he heard before teleporting back into the ORC. Occult Research Club Room, early evening. When Izuku was pulled into the ORC room, he found himself staring off into space. Rias and the others were confused about his appearance before looking down into his palms before Akino began to giggle. Issei was staring at the boy with confusion before noticing the cloth in his hands before crying tears of BLD at the fact his little brother had more game than he himself had. Rias, however, was staring at the cloth in confusion before standing up to walk towards Izuku with concern on her face. Midoriya-kun, where did you get that? Rias asked, her tone neutral and grave. See clients? Gave it to me. Izuku mumbled, his eyes swirls of movement. I see. And you didn't ask for anything else? Rias questioned, placing a palm on her hip. I was too stunned to even say a thing. Magic circle appeared and took me too fast to react. Izuku muttered before passing out on the floor. I wonder who this client is, to make him pass out on his first attempt at a contract. I'm just surprised he managed to complete the contract. Akino said, giggling to herself. So, am I? Rias replied, a small smile on her face. She took the item away and compared it to her own, and she was greatly surprised that a name was written on the BR. Murayama. Clever girl. Rias mumbled to herself with a giggle. Outside the ORC, a branch was looking slightly inflamed. Yellow fire burned on the branch as a brown hawk stared through the window of the clubroom. Brown eyes stared at the crimson-haired woman as it let out a small chirp. A small yellow magic circle revealing dark blue eyes, blonde hair, and a burgundy suit that revealed a bit of his pectoral muscles. Keep playing house. After all, it is I who will take you into my love. My dear Rias Gremory, the man said, sitting on a throne with women surrounding him. Occult Research Club Room, Kuo Academy, afternoon, after classes ended, 2265. They say a flame's greatest enemy is the wind that tries to blow it out, but they're wrong. A flame's true challenge is the soul that feeds it. You can call yourself a mortal, you can call yourself a king, but even a sun can be eclipsed by something it never saw coming. Sometimes, the smallest spark is the one that stays by your side when the world turns to ash. In the early afternoon after classes ended for the day, found Izuku training hard in the back of the ORC's courtyard. Kiba stood across the yard from him, her bakken held in her hands as she sped towards him at high speeds. Izuku ducked and weaved each attack, using his quirk in order to just land glancing flaming blows to her as she passed by him. Both knew that the other weren't using their full strength and power. But at the same time, as the two moved across the courtyard, it was as though the two were dancing against the other's rhythm. Izuku's flames danced around his body as he managed to transform his flames from a reddish orange to an emerald green. He swirled the flames around his palms as the surrounding area slowly became more and more cold over the time the two danced. Izuku ran towards Kiba as she dodged and weaved through a selected flurry of attacks before Izuku leapt away from her and pulled his right arm back and coalesced his flames into his palm. His arm stayed behind his back as the hand holding the flames trembled from exhaustion slowly creeping in, and his eyes glowed a bright emerald green as he pointed his palm towards Kiba. Nuclear flash, Izuku called out, blasting Kiba with a literal plasma beam of flames. Kiba, the ever-stoic young woman, pulled out a blade from her sacred gear, Sword BRTH. It was a blade that was surrounded by ice, and she sliced the air in front of her just as the plasma beam of flames slammed into the blade at the same time. The beam kept her blade in the air as the young woman struggled to actually hold back the flames of the young man she was currently training. The beam was split apart due to her sword cutting it into two, but at the same time, she could feel her surroundings suddenly increasing in heat after running around in the cold courtyard. Kiba managed to push through and slice her way through the beam until she quite literally stumbled because the constant stream of flames stopped. Looking up at Izuku, she found him with a somewhat manic grin on his face as he enclosed his palm towards her as he spoke up again. Nuclear hold, Izuku yelled as Kiba glanced around herself. The flaming plasma that she had held off were suddenly swinging back around towards her. And before she could even react, the plasma beam wrapped around her, though this time it wasn't hot enough to burn her, just give her a nice warm embrace. As she stood still, she watched as Izuku panted across from her, his eyes still glowing with that fire that the young woman had found very attractive in the past few days. It wasn't until he fell to a knee that steam began to fly overhead, and the plasma, holding her, fell apart as Izuku began to, in the cold air around him, to change his appearance again. This time, his body was covered in an ice armor as he struggled to cool his body down. The ice surrounding his body was melting and being replaced by more ice before it suddenly melted immediately, leaving him on his hands and knees panting even more than before. His eyes were half-lidded as he tried to focus all his strength in making sure that he stayed awake. This allowed Kiba to walk over to him, returning her blade into the ether of magic once more. She stood over him as Izuku looked up at her. The young woman may not be as well endowed as Rias or Akino, but she most definitely had a decent pair of that looked more akin to mountains to Izuku right now. How was that? Izuku asked through heavy panting breaths. You managed to catch me off guard and force me to use my sacred gear. You're growing every day. I can't believe you managed to push me that far without a sacred gear of your own. Kiba said with a giggle. So, it was be better than last time? Izuku asked, turning around to lay on his back. Yes, I'm still surprised that it's barely been a week and you've managed to get this strong. Issei was right to have you become a devil, Kiba said, helping Izuku to his feet. I'm glad. I have more purpose here than at, Izuku said, before pausing, shaking his head in disappointment. You'll be accepted here more than you would back home, yes, Kiba said, patting his head. The two would leave the field and head inside the occult research clubroom, finding Rias and the others talking to one another amicably. Though as soon as Izuku entered the room, Asia immediately hid behind Issei. It was becoming difficult for Izuku to stand near her due to her inherent fear of him after what happened just a week ago. Izuku's eyes fell to the ground in guilt as he still remembered their first encounter after that day. Asia wouldn't talk to him, just run away with fear in her eyes, as though he were the literal incarnation of the devil himself. Sighing to himself as Asia continued to fear him, Rias spoke up, gathering everyone's attention. All right, everyone, since we've got 3 new members, I'd like to state that we will be getting familiars for you 3. Rias said, as Akino and the others nodded. Finally, I can find me some big boobay familiars, Issei said with a goofy grin. Bucho, what is a familiar? Izuku asked, as Rias smiled at Izuku. A familiar is a creature that can assist you with anything that you do not have time for, such as putting my summoning slips into the mail of every known citizen of Kuo Town and doing paperwork that you can't get to, Rias said, as Izuku nodded. So, They're kind of like personal butlers and maids. Izuku asked, as Rias blushed at that comparison. Essentially in practice, yes. She said before Issei nodded. I'll make sure you find a familiar to squish your face in their massive honkers. Issei declared, pulling Izuku into his side and pointing to the ceiling. What? Izuku asked, tilting his head in confusion. He's trying to place his perversion inside your head. Kaneko grumbled from his left. Okay, I'm not averse to the idea. Just shouldn't you want to have a familiar who is, I don't know, wants to help you? Izuku asked Issei, as the young man chuckled. My goals are beyond your understanding, little brother. Issei called out, a happy grin on his face. Normally we'd have to fight Sona about familiars, but last month she already had her peerage get their final familiars. So we got the entire night in order to find at least 3 new familiars for you 3. Rias said, with a smile. With those words said, Rias set up the teleport circle that would take them to the familiar forest. Izuku stepped inside alongside the rest of the peerage, though making sure to give Asia a wide BRTH that way she wouldn't be so scared of his presence. When a magical circle began to float up towards their heads, Izuku felt the magic of the spell forming over him before glancing over at Kiba, who was having her eyes closed as the circle passed her eyes. Before he knew it, everyone in the room was teleported away from the ORC and away from Kuo Town as a whole. Familiar forest underworld. The transfer from civilization to a dark forest with black trees was stark. Izuku found himself slightly overwhelmed with the sheer scale of such a forest existing, and it seemed as though they were in the middle of the forest to boot. The young man found himself looking to Rias as the young woman actually looked at home with the other members of the peerage, aside from Issei and ACI, who were just as awed as him. The group moved forwards down the path a little bit, their eyes taking in everything that they can before hearing the sounds of tree branches being moved. Izuku glanced around himself in a 360-degree spin as he tried to pinpoint whoever was arriving. That was until he suddenly heard a laugh from high above the trees as a man landed on one of the branches ahead of the group. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Familiar Forest. I am Zatuji, and I am the Familiar MSTR. A man wearing yellow t-shirt and a red cap on his head backwards called out. The man looked to be in his early 40s to early 50s, but from where he stood it made Izuku feel shorter than he already was. He knew his height of 5 feet 5 inches was relatively short compared to most people, but seeing this man take the proverbial and literal high ground just made him feel jealous. Zatuji, I'd like for you to help 3 of my servants find a familiar to call their own tonight. Rias called as the man nodded. 1 for the girl, 1 for each of the boys. I think I've got a few that you'll like. Zatuji said with a smile. He leapt from the tree, landing in a low crouch on the ground before standing up and wiping his nose with a thumb. Walking down the path, the man would talk to the group about the kinds of familiars that live within the forest. He spoke of the multiple species of familiars that live there and how they interacted with one another before moving toward a small pond. Zatuji stated that if Issei wanted a powerful familiar who can keep up with him, then an Undine is the perfect one to conflict with his overall draconic powers. Though Issei wanted one with large dash, something he had wanted it to be apparent. The Undine that they were all shown was a very macho woman-esque Undine who was most assuredly powerful, though for both Izuku and Issei, she was far too macho for their tastes. Though Izuku stayed near the pond, he stared at the water for a few moments, his mind trying to think of a way to get one of the Undines he particularly wanted to be his familiar to show up. While the others walked through the forest, completely forgetting about him, Izuku stayed near the pond, the macho Undine watching him closely. Do you not wish to have me as a familiar? The Undine questioned. Sorry, ma'am. Just, you're too macho for my tastes. Izuku said, looking away. Good. Because I'd rather not have an MSTR who looks at me for my chest and butt. Chow! The Undine called out before disappearing in the water. Izuku was left to his own devices as the others continued down the pathway until they were no longer capable of being heard. Izuku stayed near the water because he was still slightly overheated from his quirk being used too much on the heat side. As Izuku breathed softly in the area, small amounts of steam leaving his mouth as he breathed, he suddenly heard the sound of the water dripping nearby. Turning his head to see who was standing there, he found himself staring at what amounted to being the most appealing woman he'd ever seen, aside from Kiba obviously. She stood just a bit taller than him, by about an entire foot in height. Though her curves were something out of this world in his eyes, seeing as how she was walking with a distinct sway of her hips, her bust bouncing with each and every footfall. Her eyes were a appealing ruby red that definitely clashed with her bright pink hair that bordered on rose red. And when she stopped in front of him, Izuku found himself gulping slightly at her sheer size. Each one of those lumps of fat are as big as my head, if not bigger. Izuku found himself suddenly thinking, it's nice of you to notice them. I've never been told that my were very acceptable. A feminine voice spoke from the appealing woman. Oh gosh, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to stare. Izuku yelped, moving away from the woman. Not to worry, little devil. You were searching for a familiar, yes? The woman questioned. If I said yes, are you going to leave? Izuku asked as the woman giggled. An arrow shot through his heart at how intoxicating the sound was. Why am I feeling aroused from that giggle? Izuku thought before the woman knelt before him. Would you like to have me as your familiar? She asked, tilting her head in curiosity. Will I get in trouble if I like to give you hugs? Izuku blurted out as the woman blinked at him. No, it is the familiar's job to do any and all tasks that our MSDRs are soon to be masters longing, even if they're a bit wholesome. The woman chuckled before pulling him into a hug. I think I'll take you. Izuku's voice came out, though muffled, full of joy. Familiar forest, late evening. For those of the Gremory peerage, it seemed as though everything was not going as planned. After leaving the pond with the Undine familiars, they had come across a slime familiar who could tear clothes just by its mere presence being on it. And as Hayudu called out that he wanted such a creature, Kaneko and the girls all made a unanimous decree that they will not allow such a creature to be in the capable hands of a pervert. But at the same time, Kiba found herself wondering where Izuku had gone, mainly because he disappeared as they walked through the forest. Though from Zatuji's position at the head of the pack, he seemed to be allowing it to happen. So Kiba decided to keep her eyes to herself as they came across a small sprite dragon, said to be very young at this point in time and very impressionable. The small drake would fly into Asia's generous bust before hugging her tightly. All before his Issei moved closer to the sprite dragon, it fired a small lightning blast at his face. The sheer fact that he defeated the Red Dragon Emperor with such an attack made the others laugh in hysterics. Though Asia was able to find a familiar, the others were becoming worried about Issei's very chance of attaining one. The young man was actively searching for one that could match his personality and desires, but none of the familiars would arrive. They even found themselves with another Undine, though it was an opposing element to the water elemental Undines from earlier. It was funny because Hayuda managed to find another macho Undine who had flaming hair instead of watery hair. Issei was having a very bad night, to say the least. It wouldn't be until after this moment that Rias and the others noticed Izuku's distinct absence. They were looking in all directions as they rushed back towards the very first place they stopped by, the Undine Pond, before finding a very peculiar sight. Izuku was being held in the arms of a particularly very voluptuous Undine, and though he wasn't taking advantage of the position he was in, both had steam leaving their bodies as Izuku was letting out a sigh of relief. Zatuji had actually blinked at this before opening a small notebook and writing down the appearance of this Undine before looking to Rias. Well, it seems that your servant from before managed to find a very rare familiar. Zatuji called out, as everyone aside from Izuku and Issei looked to him. What are you talking about, Zatuji? Rias asked. You know what she said? Kaneko questioned with a raised eyebrow. What I'm saying is that this particular Undine is very rare, as she is a MS to R of 2 elements instead of only 1, hence the pink hair and ruby eyes. Zatuji said, stepping forward. This isn't just any kind of Undine. They are what most children would call an EX Pokemon. This Undine has a unique ability to use both fire and water. Zatuji explained. Wouldn't it be better for him to have a water undine? Rias asked, confused. Not exactly. You said his power allows him to manipulate heat and cold temperatures, correct? Zatuji asked, curiously. That is correct, but what does that have to do with anything? Rias questioned. Well, this specific Undine has the very same capabilities as well. Not only that, but she's a one-of-a-kind Undine, seeing as how she's both very powerful and kind. Zatuji said, rubbing his nose in elation. Powerful and kind? Are powerful Undines really rude or something? Issei asked, pulling his attention from the lustful gaze he gave his brother's familiar. That ain't even the worst of it. The macho Undine you and the Rook saw earlier? That was one of the most powerful water Undines within the pond, and she's got a mean streak that multiple devils in the past gave her up because of her attitude, Zatuji said, as he walked closer to Izuku and the familiar. Hello, Zatuji. How can I be of service today? The Undine questioned, pulling her face from Izuku's curly hair. Can you tell the others about what kind of Undine you are? That way they can be sure about how rare you are. Zatuji asked, as she tilted her head. Why can you not? You already know my full race. The Undine said, as Zatuji sighed. You explaining it would have made it far easier to say. Zatuji said, before Akino interrupted. What do you mean by he knows your full race? Akino questioned, with a tilt of her head. I'm sure you all know how certain monsters cannot mate with humans or devils. Well, one such devil found a way to do so, though it took a lot of trial and error. I am what most would consider a half-breed between a succubus and Undine. The flame powers I get is from the succubus BLD, whilst the water powers I get from the Undine BLD. The Undine said, smiling. That's a lot to take in, Kiba mumbled, looking to Izuku in concern and maybe slight jealousy. You're not going to him dry, are you? Kaneko asked dryly. Of course not. I wouldn't ever dream of it. Without his permission, of course. The Undine giggled, causing Izuku to let out a small cry of embarrassment. After a long incantation to have the Undine/succubus become his familiar, Izuku found himself looking to Issei. The young man looked defeated in the entire definition of the word. As he sulked around the area, and Izuku patted his arm in a comforting way. By the time they were finished in the underworld, everyone appeared in the human realm, with Izuku staring at the familiar who was literally using a tiny form to sit on his shoulder. She acted like a literal child, kicking her legs in the air as though she weren't wearing nothing at all to cover her body from prying eyes. All right, now that this is over with, you all can get used to using your familiars to do menial tasks that you can't reach right now. But I expect you all to continue doing your job as a devil. Continue to bring in contract from potential clients. Rias said, a serious expression on her face. 4 days later, early night. In the days that passed by after the familiar forest incident for Izuku, the young man could be seen training his quirk in the Haidu household's backyard. He was sitting on the ground outside the building with his back to the glass, sliding door as he let his flames surround him. His eyes were closed as he tried to meditate in order to combine both his fire and ice powers into one working force of nature. Though, it would be better work if he wasn't constantly thinking about a familiar who just couldn't fit into clothes that were prepared for her whenever they moved about the town. After a couple days of being unable to name her, the familiar managed to remember her original name. Her name was Luvia, and she had told Izuku her dream to become the greatest familiar a devil could have, but nobody ever resonated with her unlike him. Most devils and humans seeking a familiar only looked at her for what her body could do and reproduce. Izuku saw her and only wanted to have a hug, even if he had a few accidents with her at times. And no, Izuku will not state what happened in the bathroom on the night when he returned to the Haida household, and nobody can make him say it. Currently, however, his familiar was sitting on his shoulder. But there was a slight issue. She kept him in his ear about his flames being nice and toasty. Then when he increased the ice, she said it felt like being inside a glacier. Izuku wasn't sure what she was referencing there, but it sounded weird. Her words were making it very hard to focus on meditating in order to gain full control of his quirk. But at the same time, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of warmth building in his lower gut each time she him. It felt, to him for some awful reason, very pleasurable to have a woman actively mmm his name right next to his ear. It got to the point that he had to stop meditating because of her incessant whispers into his ear. "Are you just really aroused or something?" Izuku called out, face blushing up a storm. "What's wrong, MSTR? Was Livia being a bad girl?" Livia questioned, shaking her rear on his shoulder. "Why are you constantly whispering bad things into my ear?" Izuku asked, blushing crimson. "Because I'm trying to see what makes you tick. I've never had an MSTR who didn't want to use my body for their sake." Livia said with a shrug. Do you want me to do those things to you?" "B, because that S sounds wrong without your express permission." Izuku mumbled as Livia smirked. "You have my full permission to do what you will with my body, MSTR." Livia whispered into his ear again. Izuku's eyes became swirls at this point. The flames around his body suddenly were replaced with silence. His eyes swirling around and a small bit of BLD leaving his nose as he tried to factory reset his brain. As Izuku was suffering from a total restart of his brain's functions, Livia glanced up towards the window, holding "How do we say" as a bright red flash entered the room. "So it begins, though I'm not sure why that woman would choose that deplorable young man. Though he's kind of funny, I guess she loves him for his hilarious comments." Livia mumbled to herself before transforming into her giant version. She grabbed Izuku and hit him deep within her cleavage as she carried the young man towards his bedroom. She saw another room that was created for Asia and that the young woman was currently sleeping all by her lonesome. Closing the bedroom door enough to where no sound could be heard, Livia brought Izuku to his bedroom and closed the door behind herself and laid Izuku on his bed. The young man, actually sweating a little bit from the heat of the moment earlier, she gave him a kiss on the forehead, allowing him to fall into a deep slumber. Her ruby-red eyes kept their gaze on him before exploring his dreams. She found that he was dreaming of becoming a hero, not for the human realm they had abandoned him, but for the world that took him in willingly. Saw him as an equal in terms of skill and power, though not entirely as an equal due to those who had power that far surpassed the boy's very own. But she decided to tweak the dream he was having into one that sounded much better for a boy his age. She hadn't seen any dreams in his pastime Mizudafu of the wet variety, so she decided to give him his first one here. The next day was a long and arduous one. Izuku had to spend a majority of the day hiding his groin from most people. The dream he had gone from a nice, sweet dream featuring the girls who had been his clients with suddenly going down a road that was not what he expected. It was so good that when he woke up, he pitched a tent that was so painful he had to take at least 2 showers to get rid of it. He was not happy with the fact that Livia kept placing their faces in front of his mind as he worked on his assignments, however, how he watched their faces become very aroused when he did things to them. He shook his head as he tried to work on his math homework. Livia seemed to be invisible to those around him, so that was fine with him. But what wasn't fine with him was how she kept incessantly trying to get him to become aroused during class. It worked, just Izuku didn't want to be seen pitching a tent in the middle of class. He was afraid that he'd be the butt of every joke for the rest of time if anyone found out about it. So when classes of the day were over, the sun settling down into a nice sunset, he found himself in the ORC's bathroom, taking yet another cold shower. The girls within the room itself were holding strained expressions as they could only hear Livia speaking over the sound of the shower. Izuku's indignant cries of telling the familiar to stop talking about his groin in such a fashion that when he left the bathroom, he was blushing up a storm with his familiar on his shoulder like usual. When Izuku noticed the state of the room, however, he could see everyone holding very serious expressions. Issei, though, looked more confused and feeling strange in Izuku's eyes as the young man had questioned him about true love earlier that morning when he was showering. Izuku had given him his own opinion on the matter of true love, and his opinion on the matter didn't mean anything in the grand scheme of things since he wasn't feeling like that would ever happen to him. A silver-blue magic circle appeared on the ground nearby, and Izuku found himself blinking in confusion. Even more so when a woman who looked similar to Livia entered wearing a maid's uniform as she walked over to Rias and spoke about some kind of marriage that was happening. Ria spoke about how she does not want to deal with a marriage and has already stated multiple times to her current suitor that she doesn't like him. As his confusion was mounting even further, he found himself feeling a sharp change in the ORC room's temperature. A yellow magic circle appeared within the room itself, flames lighting up the floor as a man entered. He wore a burgundy red suit without a tie, with a red shirt that was unbuttoned near the top to reveal portions of his pectoral muscles. He had the same exact expression as someone he once knew, the very same smarmy and smug expression of a boy who bullied him to kingdom come and wished for his death, specifically telling him to die to his face, and that sheer memory made Izuku pissed off at this man's appearance. He had short blonde hair with sharp eyes as he walked over to Rias, placing a palm on her shoulder. "Ah, my lovely Rias. It has been so long since Riser has come to the human world. How can you handle standing near these miserable vermin?" The man, Riser, spoke as he tried to grope her immediately. "Riser, leave me alone and stop touching my body." Rias growled as Riser got very close to her bust. As that happened, she turned away from him and slapped his hand away, the man giving a soft expression that was smug in its entirety as he spoke again. "My dear Rias, are you really sure that's how you should act towards your fiancé? After all, we need to finish the preparations for our wedding," Riser said, moving a bit of her hair out of the way and actually smelling it. Izuku didn't know what he was staring at, but he found himself somehow managing to transform his flames into a blade and pointed at his throat. Riser had the correct thought process to look towards the person who basically had him in a very dangerous situation. His eyes glanced down at Izuku's as he found the boy holding his blade, one-handed towards his throat as Izuku growled at him in anger. "I don't know who you are, I don't care who you are, and I for one thing know one XBLCD fact about you." Izuku growled as Riser raised an eyebrow. "And what would that be?" the man questioned. "I already don't like how you've treated the woman who saved my life. She is not some kind of toy you get to play with. She is a person first and foremost. You would do well to remember that." Izuku growled as the man actually laughed. "You think you can threaten Riser Phoenix? Do you even know who you were threatening, boy?" Riser growled, his flames reaching the ceiling. The maid was about to interfere when the heat of the room suddenly was replaced by a searing cold. Izuku's entire body was encased by ice that was melting, but at the same time holding against the magical fire of the Phoenix clan as though it were nothing. Izuku's own eyes were glaring into Riser's glaring eyes, a small bit of electricity sparking between the two as Riser noticed something on the boy's shoulder. It was a rather small being who looked most assuredly voluptuous by his standards. He reached a hand out to grab whatever was there before a punch was sent into his stomach, launching him to the other side of the room, comedically falling over the couch. As the man climbed back up to his feet, anger in his expression, Izuku was already standing before him. "Watch it, Phoenix. You would do well to remember that this is a neutral zone." Izuku growled. "You're the one who attacked me first, boy." Riser retorted. "You just tried to grab my familiar without my consent, nor the consent of my familiar herself. I am within every reason to defend myself." Izuku retorted just as quickly. "Wait, how do you even know about that law?" the maid questioned curiously. At Izuku's expense, everyone watched as he manifested a notebook out of thin air that had written notes on the laws of the supernatural. "Supernatural analysis for my future. I never leave home without this," Izuku said, tossing it towards the maid. "Now, Riser, can you explicitly tell us all why you are here exactly?" "I came here to ask if Rias will continue her actions of not wanting a marriage with me," Riser said, as Rias called out from behind Izuku. "Izuku, that's enough posturing. And Riser, to answer your question, I will not, nor will I ever want to marry you." "Well then, I guess this will be decided by a rating game. I will give your peerage 10 days, and then I will wipe the floor with your filthy vermin you call servants. And when I'm done, I will torture your little rook, my lovely Rias," Riser said, before disappearing into a magical circle of yellow flames. As soon as the man disappeared, alongside the maid who entered the room, Izuku found himself dissipating the ice armor on his body. all before passing out from the sheer amount of confidence he held in that moment. Grimmery Mountain Villa, Grimmery Clan Territory, Underworld, early morning, 2265. They say that gold is purified by the fire, but they forget that a reactor is built to contain it. I don't need to be unbreakable anymore. I need to be functional. 10 days isn't enough time to forget a decade of failure, but it's more than enough time to learn how to aim the blast. If I'm going to be a monster for the sake of those who gave me a home, I might as well be the most precise disaster in history. In the few hours that it took for Rias to inform Sona about the raiding game, in the next few days the students of her peerage were pulled from school. Izuku and Issei, alongside Asia, who was still fearful of Izuku, informed the Hyudu parents about the outing that Rias Gremory was taking them out on. While the Hyudus were happy with them spending time with friends, Mickey was more worried about Izuku having another meltdown like what happened at Kuo Academy. Izuku made sure to inform the two that he will be training his quirk in the time that he is being taken out on this outing by the Occult Research Club. With that knowledge, Mickey allowed them all to go, seeing as Goru was all for it. As the man was seen whispering with Mickey, whilst Izuku and Asia were leading Issei away from the house, though Asia was still looking at him with concern for him. By the time they reached the Occult Research Club room, Rias had the magic circle to teleport them to her mountain villa. It was deep in the underworld, with its sky a bright blue to represent the bright blue skies of the human world for everyone to stay used to it. At the bottom of the mountain, Rias stood in front of her entire peerage, each one wearing a massive bag on their backs to represent how much weight they need to carry in order to prepare for the raiding game itself. Since Izuku was a rook, he was carrying the same amount of weight that Kaneko was currently holding, and though it was extremely difficult since he didn't come from a supernatural family, he worked hard. He was actively the slowest person there, not because it was too difficult for him, but because, like usual, someone sitting on his shoulder whispering sweet things into his ear caused him to blush and slowly begin his descent back to where he had originally begun. Issei had actually managed to pull ahead of him as he was carrying far lighter materials within his pack to increase his strength, endurance, and stamina. The climb was filled with the girls sweetly talking to one another in hushed tones. Though Kaneko was loud about her own retorts, Izuku wasn't hearing any of it since he was slowly climbing up the mountain. It took him exactly 3.5 hours in order to climb the full mountain. And when he finally reached the top of the mountain, he was completely covered in sweat, his shirt drenched in the salty liquid as he came to a complete stop at the top of the mountain. Izuku could see Issei and the others standing near one another as Rias and Akino blinked at his arrival, recounting each peerage member present before blushing in embarrassment for forgetting him. "Sorry for thinking you were already here. Didn't think you were still climbing," Rias said with a bow. "No worries, just tired." Izuku panted heavily, sweat falling from the side of his head. "Dude, you look like you ran a marathon. How hard was it to climb up the mountain?" Issei called out as Kaneko spoke up. Because his familiar keeps whispering in his ear, it flustered him. He was constantly falling back to the beginning of the mountain, pervert. Kaneko grunted towards Issei. "Sorry, not sorry," Livia whispered in Izuku's ear with a giggle. "All right, now that Midoriya-kun is here, we can now talk about what you'll be training yourselves in while we're here," Rias said, as everyone moved into a position next to one another. Izuku slowly moved next to Kaneko as Livia used some water to douse his sweat out, cleaning him immediately. Kaneko blinked at Livia as the Undine woman had given her a wink before disappearing in blue motes of water magic. "All right, so, for Kiba-san, you'll be training yourself in how to take damage. You're a knight, and I know your position is supposed to be swift and powerful, but you need to learn how to take a hit," Rias said before sending her to train with Issei. "Issei, you'll need to learn how to use more of the boosted gear's powerful boosts. You need to be able to at least boost yourself 10 to 25 times by the end of our training," Rias said as Issei nodded. "Asia, you're to learn how to use your sacred gear in different forms. Not only that, but you'll be forced to learn how to use elemental magic," Rias said as Asia nodded herself. "Kaneko, you'll be training with Midoriya. You need to help him learn how to make his own fighting style as a rook. We cannot have him just flailing his arms around like a headless chicken and hope for something to land. Rias said, before glancing to Izuku. Of course we'll do. Kaneko replied with a bow. Now, Izuku, you are to learn how to control your quirk to complete control. You have no reason to hide behind the fact that you are still struggling to control both aspects of your quirk. By the end of the training and the rating game begins, I would hope that you've managed to MSTR your quirk and learned a fighting style. Rias said, as Izuku gave a bow of respect. As for myself and Akino, we will be increasing the magical reserves that we currently have so we can last longer in a fight. Rias said, glancing to Akino, who giggled happily, a spark of yellow electricity bouncing from her fingers. Mountain Villa training grounds. In the next few hours, for Izuku at least, life had become a living hell for him. Kaneko had made sure to try and get him to use only the ice side of his quirk, and as he covered himself in his ice armor, Kaneko was easily able to break through it. Considering he only fought Kiba with the ice armor, he desperately needed someone who could break through his ice in order to help him use its durability to increase both strength and his own durability. As he threw a wide right hook towards Kaneko, she ducked under the attack with very little ease and kicked him in the stomach, causing his ice armor to break once more. Skidding across the ground, Izuku fell to a knee as he panted heavily from the long training session. Kaneko walked over to him, kneeling over him with her neutral expression, and spoke in a tone that was meant to sound uplifting but sounded way worse, as though she were mocking him. You know, you almost hit me there. You're getting better, but you need to learn a fighting style. Kaneko bluntly stated. Kind of hard to do that when I'm tired. Izuku panted. You're just not trying hard enough. Kaneko said, as Izuku paused for a moment. You're not trying hard enough. Kaneko's voice rang in his head. A small flicker of fire surrounded his fist as he thrusted it towards her face, in a moment of pure, unadulterated rage, only for the punch to be grabbed, having him flipped over his smaller senpai, in terms of time as a devil, and then left staring at the sky in complete and utter failure. Kaneko stared down at him again. Only this time her eyes were softer than before as she spoke again. Don't let your anger get the better of you. It will lead to your own death, Kaneko said, as Izuku couldn't help the hatred and fear in his voice scream out at her. I know, I already tried. Izuku screamed at her face, causing her eyes to widen. No words were stated between the two as Kaneko stared down at him with wide eyes. Izuku's panting voice came out in ragged gasps as Luvia spawned next to him as the heat in the surrounding area began to increase higher and higher as Izuku's body increased in its trembling. I know that my anger is not a good idea. I never had an outlet for any form of anger and mad feelings that I ever felt because I was raised to never use it. But now that I'm in a place where I somewhat feel I belong, I only find out that the power I have was only dormant, which leaves me asking more questions than I'm getting answers. Izuku growled, slamming his fist into the ground. I know that I need a fighting style. I know that I need to grow up and stop being a Deku who cries all the time. And I most certainly know that if I continue like this, it will lead to my death. Because I already tried killing myself. Izuku screamed into the world. I didn't know, Kaneko said, as Izuku stood upright as his flames surrounded his body. Of course you don't know, nobody's ever asked me if I was okay. Izuku screamed, slamming his fists into the ground. As he was screaming, the flames surrounding him increased in their intensity, his entire form becoming completely covered in a massive bonfire of living flames as he fired the bonfire straight into the sky in order to release all the hatred and anger he was feeling in this moment. The sight of the beam of literal fire blasting into the sky garnered the attention of everyone in the peerage as they came rushing, though Asia stayed behind a nearby tree in order to keep herself safe. Rias and the others arrived to find Izuku in complete and utter fury as he glared over at Kaneko as she stood frozen in place. What the hell is going on here? Rias called out angrily. As soon as those words left her mouth, Izuku's eyes flicked over to her. and she found the boy to be looking angrier than he'd been when he first manifested his quirk, but he let his flames dim before he was doused in literal gallons of water. Steam massively fell off his body in waves as he held his arms out to his sides, allowing everyone to move closer to find out what in the hell had set him off. Izuku, what the hell happened? Why are you so angry? Issei called out, pushing through the steam to find Izuku on his knees. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to say that. Izuku mumbled as he stared at his hands. Izuku, what happened? Kiba asked as Livia appeared. Kaneko stated some very bad choice words about how he was letting his anger get the better of him, and it led to Izuku becoming furious and screaming out something that he probably had kept hidden from everyone but Issei here. Livia said as Izuku froze in place. Why you hurt? Izuku asked, his eyes shrinking in size. I am your familiar. I saw your memories. Why do you think I've been trying to act all stuck as of late? Livia questioned with a happy smile. Kaneko, what did you tell him? Rias asked, kneeling in front of Kaneko, who had a single tear falling from her eye. I only told him that if he continued to let his anger get the better of him, that would lead to his death. Kaneko said, as Rias frowned at that. Issei, why would Izuku get mad about those words? What she stated is true. If one were to fall into their emotions to the point they can't think straight, it can lead to certain death. Rias questioned. Issei glanced between Izuku and Livia before sighing. Bucho, the reason Izuku is now living with me instead of being in Mizurufu is because he tried to kill himself when I first met him. Issei said, his voice soft. Mountain Villa Mansion, late afternoon. After that talk, Rias decided that everyone needed a break before continuing with their training. Izuku could be seen in the other side of the room, staying as far away from anyone as much as possible for both himself and those near him. Issei was the only one who was consistently allowed to be near the boy as he struggled to come to terms about his new life and how everyone now knows the reason why Issei hadn't told them where he'd found Izuku. Izuku had spent his entire life before the Haidu's and the peerage life under Rias in literal hell. He'd have been forced to survive a life that had wanted nothing to do with him. They tortured him, mentally abused him, and told him to kill himself. Though that last one wasn't something he never really heard all too often, but after Bakugo had told him that to his face, it seemed as though everyone around him found something to jeer about him before Izuku met Issei. Izuku was struggling to even think straight half the time because he still had thoughts of whether he wasn't good enough. Hell, he even scared Asia half to death when he came to rescue her from the fallen angels and priests. It may not have been his initial intention, but at the same time a hero shouldn't be someone who scares those he would like to call friends by his mere presence. They should feel safe. And Asia still didn't seem to feel safe around him. Even more so now that his past before meeting them came into play. Asia was more scared for the fact that Izuku would never stick around. If he was that mentally ill, it would probably be best for him to either get some therapy or be placed in some form of containment to prevent his untimely demise. Though Livia was doing her best to keep Izuku calm as much as possible, it was a fleeting effort. His anger and sorrow completely kept switching with one another every few minutes, and that was causing stark temperature differences in the mansion. Izuku was so scared that he'd be abandoned yet again, that he felt he needed to try hard enough to protect everyone around himself that he didn't care if he looked like a monster to them. If his death was what they needed to survive, in his current mindset, he would give his life and then some in order to keep them safe. Do you think you can tell us who thought it was a good idea that killing yourself was a good idea? Rias asked, standing in front of the door where Izuku had locked himself inside of. It was someone I once thought of as a friend. I don't want to talk about it. Izuku called out through the door. You do know that talking about it might help you deal with the emotions of it all, right? Rias questioned, her tone sounding motherly. The door was opened to reveal a red-eyed Izuku who looked to have been crying to himself. Livia appeared next to him, her height making him look as though he were her child in comparison as she softly placed a palm on his shoulder. Though the Undine/Succubus hybrid didn't give her a harsh look, she was giving the Grimmery-era look that was stating she had a small amount of time left before he'd close the door. Look, we're not going to abandon you. We just wish to help you through whatever problem you're suffering from. Rias said, softly placing her palm on his shoulder. Izuku flinched slightly from her palm, touching his shoulder, and while she wanted to talk about that specifically, she stayed quiet. She waited for Izuku to speak up as he moved out of her way to allow her inside the room itself. Upon entering the room, Izuku sat down at the bed's edge with Luvia wrapping her arms around him as water magic surrounded his body, except for his head. It seemed that the literal bonfire that Izuku created earlier was still causing him some damage to his body. "What do you want to know?" Izuku asked, his voice raspy and slightly cold. "I'd like to know the name of the person who told you that killing yourself was the right answer," Rias said, leaning towards him, her teal eyes staring into his emerald. "Like I said before, it was someone I looked up to as a friend, but he's probably having the best time of his life at UA High School," Izuku said, staring at his hands. "What's his name?" Rias asked, her tone soft. "Bakugo Katsuki, a boy who I looked up to as my hero of victory," Izuku said, hugging his arms to his chest. "Thank you for trusting me with that information," Rias said, as Izuku glanced at her. "What are you going to do? You going to steal his soul or something? I thought devils don't do that sort of thing," Izuku questioned as Rias chuckled. "I never said I was going to steal his soul, and I said that most devils don't do that anymore. And I never said that I wouldn't inform anyone about what that boy has done to you," Rias said, as Izuku shook his head. "It'll be your word against his. He won't be capable of being charged," Izuku said, as Rias thought about a retort. "You may be right about that, but what if he comes across you again? What will you do then?" Rias questioned, her voice level but soft at the same time. "Probably kill him," Izuku said, surprisingly bluntly. "You'd kill him?" Rias asked, concern in her tone. "I almost went through with killing myself after both he and my idol crushed my dreams. Though one has been crushing my dreams for my entire life, so I can't really be mad at that," Izuku said, looking away. "Again, thank you for this information. I'll let you get some rest, Midoriya," Rias said, patting his head softly. When she left the bedroom, she found herself staring down the hall to find a long set of blonde hair peeking around the corner. Walking towards a person, she found Asia standing there with her hands clenching and unclenching. The young woman looking as though she wanted to speak to Izuku, but couldn't do so due to her own fear of the young man. "Are you all right, Asia?" Rias asked, as Asia stared up at her. "He scares me, Bucho. You didn't see how he killed the priests and fallen angels. He looked like one of those villains who laugh at the deaths of those around him," Asia said, her tone fearful. "Who would you rather have saved you from villain? A hero who has tendencies to become villain-like in the rescue, but be kind towards everyone, no matter who they come across? Or would you like for someone to be hero-like, but be villainous towards everyone else, including you?" Rias questioned. "Obviously, I'd like for the person to be kind to me and anyone they come across," Asia said, as Rias nodded. "He scared you because he was drunk on having a power for the first time. He had gone literally 48 hours on a power pleasure high because he'd lived 14 years of his life without a single power," Rias said, as Asia frowned. "That should be statistically impossible, though. A quirkless person shouldn't be capable of manifesting a power so late in their lives," Asia mumbled, as Rias paused near the end of the stairs. "Maybe you're looking at him the wrong way then. Sure, he was scary when killing those fallen angels and priests, but you should think of the bigger picture here. Without him, you may have been dead by the time Issei found you," Rias said, as Asia remained in the hallway. Mountain Villa Mansion Kitchen. Rias entered the kitchen with a small smile on her face. She had looked up the name of Bakugo Katsuki in the human records, finding the boy almost instantly before cross-referencing him to match the description of a boy who was already living life in UA. She searched the school files for a boy by that name, and quickly found a young man's name as Issei entered the kitchen with Akino and Kiba, the two women seemingly following Issei because he wanted to show them something. Rias was wearing her reading glasses, her eyes watching as Hayudu lead the two girls into the room. "What's the issue, Issei?" Rias asked, tilting her head. "I know what you're doing. You're planning some form of vengeance against that Bakugo kid, aren't you?" Issei questioned, crossing his arms over his chest. And how did you come up with this information? Rias questioned. Rias, we all know how protective you are of your pieces, especially now that you know that one of your own servants, that you look at as though they were your own children, was told to kill himself. We know you're trying to find a way to get back at the boy in question, and we want in. Aquino said, giggling. I just want to talk to him, nothing more. Kiba said, looking to Rias with a determined expression. I highly doubt that you'll be doing any form of talking. Rias said, raising an eyebrow at Kiba. Oh no, I will be castrating him so nobody else will ever see the next generation of that boy ever in the future. Kiba said, pulling out a small knife. A knife still counts as a sword. Yeah, I'm going to put a pin on that parade. We're not going to be castrating nor torturing him. Rias said, before pulling up the boy's file. But we will be making sure his teachers know what he's done. That way he can have his life be a living hell in the very school he believes is his rightful place within the world. Rias said, her smile sadistic. I still want a dragon smash his face into the ground. Issei grumbled. You'll get your chance in the future, Issei. Rias said, waving him off. She stayed quiet for a few moments longer, finishing her information gathering on Bakugo, all before turning around and stretching her limbs over her head and staring at everyone present. Even Asia was within the kitchen now. Anyways, for now I think I know what should be happening for training from here on out. Until Izuku can get all the anger and hatred, and this includes the sorrow he feels, out of his system, we will need to have him train alone for a day or two. Then he can get back in the groove of martial arts. Issei, I need you to have Kaneko find a fighting style to best suit him. Rias said, as Issei nodded before rushing away. Aquino, I'll need you both to help him learn how to use magic. He can't rely on his quirk the entire time for the raiding game. He'll need some magic to use before he starts to rely on his quirk. Rias said as the two women nodded and left the kitchen. Asia stared up at Rias, her face scrunched up in the effort to not cry in her presence, but nearly failing. What am I supposed to do? Asia asked, concerned. You need to find a way where you can look at him as both a friend and comrade. Rias said, softly patting her head. Grimmery Mountain Villa, Training Grounds, early morning, 2265. They tell you that a shadow is just a lack of light, but they never tell you that the brightest flames cast the deepest ones. I've spent so long staring at the monster in the mirror that I forgot the monster was the only thing that kept the boy alive. It takes a certain kind of strength to burn the world down, but it takes a much greater strength to let someone close enough to help you blow out the match. In the early part of the evening, Izuku could be seen laying on the bed within the room accommodated for him and Issei. The young man was sleeping at the moment, but Izuku couldn't help but feel extremely restless because of what happened. Leaving the room early in the night, while everyone was resting from the events of the first day of training, the young devil found himself outside of the mansion in the training field. His breathing was normal, his eyes staring up at the moon shining brightly in the artificial sky that was made in order to replicate the human realm sky. Taking a deep breath, Izuku let his flames flicker around his body to provide warmth. Standing in the middle of the training area, in the dark expanse of the night, he was lit up like a beacon, and he stretched a palm out towards the air. He wanted to test something the other day, but couldn't because his anger got the better of him, causing him to release a large, deep-seated anger he'd never felt before becoming a devil. Before he was a devil, he was able to hide his feelings, mainly because he lived a life where nobody cared for those feelings, so why should he? He pulled all his flames into his palm, not wanting to do anything more than test a theory. He had used this very same move against Kiba earlier that week, just before getting his familiar Livia at the familiar forest. He had originally called the move Nuclear Flash, but he wanted to change the naming scheme from that of atomic structure to that reflecting the bright sun during the day. He watched as the flames he'd produced had swirled around in the air around him, each lick of it swirling in his palm as though it were coalescing into something greater than he'd ever believe it could be. By the time he felt the flames transform into plasma, he decided to try and charge it further than before. If he was going to give this attack, he was about to release into the dark evening sky. He wanted to be sure that this would be powerful enough to make it impossible to block. A strange, swirling light began to spin around towards his palm, as though he were taking the heat from the very air in order to increase his output of damage. His face scrunched up with the effort required for him to actually be capable of doing this. By the time he felt as though the energy collected was enough, he grunted out the name of his new attack. Solar Crusher. Izuku grunted out before throwing the small ball of plasma fire into the air. The small ball had blasted out into the sky as though it were launched by a catapult. It swirled around in the air before Izuku decided to enclose his hand as soon as he felt it was a great distance to not wake anyone up with the explosion. The very moment his palm closed itself into a fist, he watched as the plasma ball suddenly compacted into itself before exploding outward, creating a sight similar to another sun. It was bright and brought an emerald glow to the area surrounding him, and at the same time, he didn't feel as though he were tired at all. Blinking in confusion, Izuku stared down at his arms and legs, finding a small aura surrounding him that took on the appearance of emerald flames. Patting at his shoulders and legs did nothing to prove that it was actual fire. Thinking back, he'd actually only used one hand for that attack, so looking to the villa mansion and finding nobody looking outside, he decided to try something else. Cupping his hands together, he poured his heart and soul into this next one, pulling on the heat of the air and his own projected flames in order to create this new form of plasma. As though the very world was reacting to the level of power he was pulling upon, a lightning slid the land beside him. It didn't hit him exactly, but it was followed by a second one before a third, until a small spark of electricity bounced from the ground onto his leg. It wasn't enough to distract him, but it was enough to make his right leg spasm and lock itself into place before he watched his flames and the particles of heat swirl into his cupped hands. Izuku would watch as the flames would spin ferociously around in his palm as he cupped his fingers around the ball of plasma. With nowhere to go, the ball of energy began to increase in size as Izuku kept his cupped hands facing the sky. He wanted to be sure that this next one will leave him tired more than anything he'd ever felt before. It wasn't until the last lightning strike slammed into the ground next to him that someone came outside. And it wasn't who he ever expected to check up on what was going on outside. He'd expected it to be Rias or Issei. But Izuku had never thought to expect that Akino of all people would wake up and come outside. Izuku couldn't move from his position, though. He'd collected the energy required to use this blast, and the black-haired vixen was staring both at him and at the lightning bouncing across his right leg before licking her lips. "I need an adult," Izuku thought to himself. "So, what brings you out here this early in the morning, Midoriya-kun?" Akino asked, walking towards him. "I was restless. Majima-sen," Izuku called out, though it was muffled mostly by the lightning striking the ground. "You might want to fire that thing before it gets too powerful," Akino teased, causing Izuku to blush and accidentally misfire. "Oh dash! Shoot! 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 There goes the solar flash," Izuku thought as the beam traveled deep towards one of the nearby mountains. Akino and Izuku would watch on in concern as the beam traveled towards the mountain in the distance. Izuku was concerned that its range was going to be too vast before hearing a loud bang off in the distance. It was followed by the beam suddenly increasing in size and blasting a small hole through the mountain in the distance. Both of the two just stood there gawking at the hole in the distance from Izuku's energy before the boy fell to a knee, steam beginning to rise from his body as Luvia suddenly appeared next to him to douse him in water magic. Thank you, Luvia-san. I wasn't paying attention to my body's needs," Izuku muttered as Luvia giggled. "Don't worry, Mr. I'm here to make sure you don't overheat yourself," Luvia said, patting his head. "So, mind telling me why you were out here, Midoriya?" Akino asked curiously. I was restless after what happened yesterday. I couldn't sleep, so I decided to waste some of my energy so I could sleep," Izuku mumbled, looking away. "I see. What are your plans for tomorrow anyway?" Akino asked, wrapping her arms under her bust. Izuku's eyes flickered to her bust for a minute second before looking away with a blushing face. And nothing much, Himejima-san, just probably training myself and my quirk a bit more. Why? Well, I'd like to begin your magical training under myself today. You can start right now, or later in the morning if you'd like. Akino said, before walking back into the building. Oh, dear Satan, I'm not sure if I'd be able to be in her presence again. Izuku mumbled, as Livia giggled. And you can stand being in mine? Livia asked with a sultry tone. A little bit. Izuku muttered whilst blushing. The two remained outside, letting the cool, crisp air help cool Izuku's body down further. Until they felt it was enough for him to return back inside the building, they went to bed, unaware of the green eyes that had been watching them earlier. Early morning, day 2 of training for raiding game. Waking up 2 hours later was not fun for Izuku, as he lethargically walked around the mansion. He entered the kitchen and pulled out what normally would have been a normal cup of milk and drank the entire gallon all on his own to just wake himself up. Turning around to see what was going to be his plans for the day, he found Akino staring at him with wide eyes and a growing blush on her own face as she stared at the empty gallon of milk in his hand. That blush went back to normal for a moment before she spoke up to him. Are you fully awake? She asked curiously. A little bit now, Izuku said, grumbling softly. Well then, for your first lesson it will be to create your own magical circle, specifically for you to use your own spells. Akino said, as Izuku pulled out a piece of paper. I wanted to use this appearance for the sigil. Is that alright? Izuku asked. https:// dreams steamicum/magic circle witchcraft type blank to fill spell text games anime sun moon star for elemental symbols image. This is the image. That seems as though it's perfect for your role. Though I have to ask, why did you ask for this specific one? Akino asked, curiously staring at the sigil. Because if I'm going to be the wall that is nigh impenetrable, I need to use a sigil that makes me seem like I am impenetrable. Izuku replied, as he manifested the sigil immediately. Wow, I thought it would take you a bit longer to produce it. Akino said, in awe of the emerald green sigil. I practiced it before going to bed, since you said we were going to do magical lessons. I wanted to get a little head start. Izuku mumbled, poking his index fingers together and looking away. Aren't you just a little treat? Akino teased before patting his head again. For the next few hours, Akino would teach him everything she knew about magic, especially demonic magic, and how he needed to use it with purpose, and that magic wouldn't be used without a purpose to be using the magic in the first place. He learned everything he needed to, ranging from ice magic and water magic to fire magic and gravity magic of all things. When Akino said that she was going to teach him everything she knew, she wasn't kidding. She crammed about 10 years' worth of magical lessons into a few hours of learning due to his ability to learn on the fly. When Issei entered the kitchen himself, he found Izuku currently balancing multiple boxes filled with ice, all with gravity magic. When asked about how much the ice weighed, Akino gave a rough estimate of around at least 3 to 5 tons of ice. Issei's eyes bug out of his head at seeing his little brother doing so well in terms of magical lessons, but at the same time, he was extremely proud of him for being able to learn so fast. All that was left for Izuku to learn at this point was how to deal with his emotions properly, since he's around people who can actively help him through his struggles. All he needs to do is learn how to let them in. Training grounds, early morning. Izuku was in the middle of the training grounds, his eyes slightly half-lidded, and yet he was full of energy. He thrusted a palm into the air, before following it with a multitude of kicks before jumping into the air and swinging his other leg towards the dirt. The ground cracked and cratered before Izuku spun around and swung his fist towards the potential enemy coming from behind, swinging at the air, before twisting his body around and creating a magical sigil to block a pretend ball of energy he'd blasted out earlier to catch him unawares. When the ball of energy dissipated, he swung his fist out one last time towards where he assumed would be the solar plexus of his shadow enemy. Pausing in that moment, Izuku had felt himself doing 2 of 3 things. The first one was how he was training his body, even though he was mentally exhausted, and the second was that he had a feeling that he was being watched at the moment. Taking a deep breath, Izuku pulled his shirt off his torso and tossed it aside. Izuku had learned through illusion magic that he could hide things that he didn't want anyone finding out about. One such thing was a scar that went across his chest and down towards his abdomen. It was a long scar that made it look as though he had been sliced with a blade, which wasn't that far off from the truth, though not really. It was an accident from when he was being bullied years ago. A young boy who was around the age of 13 at the time had swung his arm at Izuku, intending to punch him in the face. It had transformed into a blade halfway and sliced through his chest and went down towards his lower abdomen. He nearly bled out that day, but surviving it made him feel better. Izuku then turned on the ice portion of his power to encompass himself in his ice armor. Holding it up, he decided to test out its durability and found that his rook's strength could easily bypass its defense quite easily. So standing still, he let more of his ice portion of his quirk out onto his body, replacing the cracked and broken ice with newer ice that could possibly be strong enough to handle the next blow. He focused his mind on just tanking the blows, making sure that if the next hit broke his ice, he'd increase the durability of the ice as much as possible until no cracks or craters within the ice could be seen. By the time the sun had reached high noon, Izuku decided to take a long break. His eyes looked over the entire training field. He'd seen Issei fire off a dragon shot towards the very same mountain that he'd blasted towards the previous night. And instead of seeing a relatively small hole on the mountain itself, Izuku and the others nearby watched as a major portion of the mountain was eviscerated from existence. Comparing his own quirk's power and precision to a blast like that, Izuku knew for a fact that he wouldn't be capable of blocking that level of power. And to think that he's going to get far stronger in the future. Izuku thought to himself, feeling a little bad for himself. "And Midoriya-san? See, can I talk tea to you?" Asia's voice called out from behind a tree. Glancing over at the tree, Izuku found himself grimacing in guilt. Asia stood behind the tree, clearly still afraid of him, but he got up and slowly walked towards the area she was standing. By the time he got over there, he made sure to give her a wide BRTH. That way she had plenty of escape routes if she got too scared to speak to him. "What do you need, Argento-san?" Izuku asked, his tone light, but guilt layered within. "I'd like to apologize," Asia said, lowering her head and bowing. "Why do you need to apologize?" Izuku asked, as Asia lifted her body and stared at him with tears in her eyes. "Because I've done nothing more than alienate you from everyone else. I've been too scared to admit that you helped Hayate-san save me just a week ago, and I couldn't live with that anymore, especially after what Bucho told me yesterday." Asia said, rubbing her arm. "You haven't been alienating me. I know my actions produced your fear. I wasn't exactly all that present on the day we saved you," Izuku said, looking away, sadness on his expression. "But wasn't it my fault that you had to look like that?" Asia asked, as Izuku shook his head. "It was my own fault that I looked like a monster to you. I'd lived 14 years of my life without a power that everyone else had. And the one time I can use it to save someone, I went and got drunk on the power," Izuku said, kicking a stray rock nearby. "But shouldn't it be my fault for getting into that situation in the first place?" Asia asked, as Izuku shook his head. "There was nothing you could do. Issei told me everything that happened. You're not at fault," Izuku retorted, still shaking his head. "Then who should I blame for the guilt I feel for hurting you for so long?" Asia asked, as Izuku thought about it. "You didn't hurt me, Asia. If anything, I was the one who caused your fear to erupt. It was my failure to keep myself in check that caused you to not want anything to do with me," Izuku said, turning to walk away. "But can't we work on that together?" Asia asked, raising a hand to him, but pausing just a few feet away. "We can, but it can't be right now. I need to get back to training. But before that must happen, I'd like to see if you truly mean those words by putting them into action," Izuku said, walking away, causing a stray tear to fall down the side of her cheek. This marks the end of part 1 of What If Deku joined DXD and accidentally started a hero harem. A big thanks to NINJ45 for granting the permission to feature this amazing fanfiction. Please like the video and subscribe to Deku Universe for more interesting stories. Thank you, and see you soon.